Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, our small, quaint American town was nestled in the heart of a beguiling valley that overlooked exquisite mountainous views, that dappled the distant horizon in a hazy, ethereal kaleidoscope of pale blues, pinks and purples, that looked like an artist's loving, talented hands had skillfully, painstakingly painted them in on the landscape with the subtle hues of watercolours. The individualistic, unorthodox houses in our rural neighbourhood were built relatively close to each other, but with sufficient enough gaps between the houses to give every resident some breathing space, so that you couldn't hear your neighbour engage in a barney with their other half, which was a monumental relief as far as I was concerned. When I was 7 years old, both my parents had lived in an apartment in town. We lived next door to a couple that was constantly bickering, like two sniping, belligerent dogs, and then making up all the time. The walls in the apartment were so fine and so paper-thin that we could hear everything that was going on. Nothing was left to the imagination. It would seem the intricacy of the couple's relationship, from their volatile explosive outbreaks to their intimate moments when they were copulating, while their noisy cumbersome bedpost would constantly bump against my wall, as I was the one that lived in the bedroom next to theirs. So let's just say I heard some things that taught me a thing or two about adult relationships that I would rather not have been privy to at that impressionable young age. When I say the houses were individualistic, they were exactly that. Idiosyncratic might be a better word to actually use. Some houses on the street dated back to Victorian times. Others had been built in the 50s, the 60s, 70s and 80s, while some were more recent modern renovations. So I like to compare the houses with different free-spirited, quirky characters, for they had distinctive personalities of their own. Some were old-fashioned, others simplistic, bohemian, ornate or even modern, innovative and contemporary. So it was indeed an eclectic, vibrant mix of varied tastes and styles. The house that I was privileged to live in with my parents was built in the 50s. So the ivory cream exterior was simplistic, symmetrical, but exceedingly pretty in a girl next door kind of way. Our front yard was pristinely mown, decorated with a cobbled path that led directly to the dark blue front door. The ribbon of road that ran down our street had recently been repaved with asphalt, so riding down the road on our bicycles was an absolute joy. The road was so delightfully smooth. The pavements on either side of the road were lined with tall, imposing oak trees that were very dignified, mature and lofty, and their branches moulded into each other, creating a vast, awe-inspiring canopy above our heads, which meant our street was heavily shaded. The common land and front yard space in the anterior of our long line of homes was very generous. People during the summer and spring would have the most phenomenal eye-catching flowery displays of terracotta pots, hanging baskets and flower beds filled with colourful blooms. The backyards on our side of the street were quite sizable, but they were fenced in, as the private land that lay beyond belonged to a farmer where a heavily wooded area sprawled out into meadows, where cows grazed happily all day long. Living in a rural neighbourhood, where we were on first-name terms with each other, was an expedient privilege. We had the sort of magnanimous neighbours that you could borrow sugar from should you run out of the essential ingredient when in the throes of baking a cake or something. That happened quite a lot with my mother. She so often overlooked the most basic ingredients in her shopping list, possibly because she never wrote a list in the first place, which highly infuriated my punctilious father. I was an only child, which I thought was a distinct disadvantage at the time, envying anyone who had a brother and sister, thinking that they had a better deal than I did. I falsely perceived that I was most unfortunate, but all these years later, I'm not so sure that I was. As being an only child meant I got my parents' consummate attention, so invariably their congruent devoted love wasn't divided between several siblings, nor could my parents have any favourites. They were saddled with me, whether they liked it or not. So I was the one that was invariably spoilt and loved, even when I wasn't that easy to love. For believe me, I had my moments when I was not the most agreeable. I was fortunate to live next door to a young boy, who was the same age as I was, who had a baby brother of whom he had nothing in common with, due to the vast 11-year age gap between the two of them. His name was Jack Clarkson. I liked him an awful lot. It never bothered him that I was a girl, which was a big plus for me. We lived in the kind of unassailable, secure neighbourhood, where people would go to bed at night, not bothering to lock their doors, as there was no crime in our area. But that soon was to change, when our street was hit with a mysterious spate of enigmatic filiginous robberies that happened on our side of the street. The first person to be robbed in our street was old Miss Felicity Kendall, who lived in the house several doors down from us. At 12 years old, I thought she was ancient. She was an elegant, enervated old woman, who was so petite, enfeebled and frail. I would often think that if the weather became tempestuous, she would be knocked over and blown away, like a languid feather by the blustery, unrestrained wind. People in our town always gravitated towards my mother when they were upset about something, so I learnt soon exactly what happened to Miss Kendall first-hand when the robbers broke into her house. I would surreptitiously park myself on my mother's large Persian rug that was thrown across the parquet floor of our living room next to the sofa, while my mother did her level best to reassure her distressed guest. She was a natural counsellor. She was empathetic, mellow and kind by nature. On this occasion Miss Kendall's face was as white as a sheet, her blue eyes so very large with fear they almost looked too big for her face. She stood in the doorway trembling. My mother quickly led her into our living room, while she went to the kitchen to make some tea, returning with a large silver tray, a bottle of brandy, and a large plate of chocolate biscuits. My mother always believed brandy and chocolate could help in every emergency situation. My mother poured Miss Kendall a piping hot cup of tea in her best Royal Dalton teacups, and poured a tot of brandy in the cup, which she quickly handed to the old lady. Miss Kendall took it from her, but her hand was shaking so much that the cup rattled precariously. For a moment I was certain she was going to drop it, as she was wobbling so much. But after a couple of sips, the brandy seemed to settle the frazzled woman's nerves. My mother was absolutely right. It was amazingly effective stuff. "Please tell me what on earth is wrong," she asked Miss Kendall. "I was robbed last night," she said, the words coming out of her mouth in a quiet, faint whisper. Almost as if she said them too loud, they'd come back to bite her like a boomerang. "Oh, no," said my mother, gasping, clasping her hand over her mouth in astonishment. "What on earth happened?" "I thought I heard a noise. I'm a light sleeper, so I'm easily roused. Actually, I thought it was Percival coming through the cat flap into the kitchen. Sometimes it's a tight squeeze for him. That cat is desperately overweight. Of course, it's all my fault. I feed him way too much. I give in to his every whim. He's a very demanding cat. He's also a lot less agile than other cats, given his great rounded girth. So I thought it was him making this rather unfortunate thumping, scratching noise. I thought maybe he was now so fat that his mighty girth had got stuck and trapped in the cat flap. But then I was almost certain I'd heard footsteps. I glanced briefly at my bedside clock. It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning. I surreptitiously climbed out of bed, tiptoeing cautiously onto the carpeted landing. I glanced down the long staircase. That was when I saw two figures dressed in black, wearing balaclavas on their faces. One of those faces looked directly up at me, and for a moment we locked eyes. Felicity suddenly grabbed my mother's hands, squeezing them tightly to give her some emotional support. I just remember those big blue eyes staring up at me. Oh, I was so scared. I immediately dashed into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I was shaking so much, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I heard a crashing sound, and the men just fled. Finally, I managed to call the police, but the only thing I could tell them about the two mysterious offenders was that they were wearing black, and one of them had piercing blue eyes, which doesn't exactly give them much to go on, does it? Miss Kendall took another few mouthfuls of tea. She grabbed a chocolate biscuit, which she nibbled gracefully, like a tiny mouse. "So did they take anything?" my mother asked. "They did, as it happens. They stole some pieces of antique silver from my dining room cabinet display. Some of those pieces are worth a fair bit. They also stole my treasured antique clock that is displayed on the mantel. That's worth a bob or two. So whoever they are, they clearly know a thing or two about antiques. I was going to leave those pieces to my children in my will, so I am bitterly disappointed by the theft, for even the contents insurance cannot compensate for some of those rare, irreplaceable finds." "That is terrible, Felicity," said my mother. "I wish I knew what to say to you, but I don't. There are no words. It's horrifying. How do you think the robbers got into your house?" Miss Kendall flushed pink. "Through the kitchen door," she exclaimed. "I always forget to lock it, but I never worried about that. I've never known our neighbourhood to be unsafe." "Well, that's hardly your fault," came my mother's reassuring voice. "You weren't to know someone would barge through your door like that. It's very distressing. What did the police say?" "Well, they said that these days robbers are much more brazen than they used to be, with the increase in drug consumption and addicts. And sometimes it's not just men that do the robbery. There are women as well, although some of them turn to prostitution. But they take risks that they wouldn't normally take to support their addiction. But they did say this is one of the first burglaries in our small town for many years." At that, a little tear spilled down Miss Kendall's cheek, like a long raindrop on a glass pane. "Now there," said my mother. "Please don't get upset, Felicity. The good news is they absconded when they saw you. They didn't hang around, nor did they hurt you. So that's a great big plus." Of course, when news of Miss Kendall's burglary got around our small town, people's heckles rose, while family households worried about their own safety. Some people even installed alarm systems, and a couple of people put up fake cameras, which my father thought was absolutely ridiculous, as he said you can't fool anyone with a fake camera. People always know when they're fake. I couldn't help thinking my father was possibly right, but we were one of those families that installed an alarm system. At first, having an alarm seemed like a novelty. I thought it was exciting having the state-of-the-art panel in our entrance hall, but I was soon to realise it was the most annoying accessory or gadget in our home. I cannot tell you the number of times something would set it off, possibly a fly flying past trying to make its hasty escape. It had the capacity to scare the whole family half to death. As the motion activator was stimulated, then the alarm would invariably go off, so a simple little fly would have caused our entire family a restless night's sleep. So I grew to despise that alarm system, which had the most annoying loud blaring noise that was more scary than anything else, if I'm being brutally honest. For a while there were no more robberies in our small town. Even our family slackened in their vigilance, prematurely relaxing in the surveillance. Soon we overlooked activating the alarm system, until in a matter of weeks there were 3 more robberies in our street in the very same week, which made us all feel the more vulnerable. As why were the burglars picking on our street, for goodness sake, abandoning and forsaking other neighbourhoods? It felt as if our street was being clandestinely watched, our coming and goings monitored and recorded. The first robbery happened to the Andrews family, who'd gone away for the weekend. They returned home to find all their prized stuff in their house had been evacuated, from valuable priceless antiques, artworks on the walls, some select pieces of furniture, and even their flat-screen television. The police had warned them that lightning can indeed strike in the same place twice, and it probably would. It was more than a little likely. The robbers would indeed return when they replaced the goods with their household insurance policies, and they were absolutely right about that, for the Andrews were robbed 3 more times, if I'm not mistaken. The other family to be robbed was the Sinclair household, who were about 5 doors down from us. They were absolutely shocked to have slept through the entire robbery, not hearing a single thing. But the glass panel in their downstairs sliding door had been perfectly cut with an expert precision. The robbers had gained entry that way and had seized some quality stuff and a contemporary piece of artwork that had cost the family an arm and a leg. So these burglars, whoever they were, appeared to be remarkably astute. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They succeeded in locking up the 2 golden retrievers in the sizable downstairs toilet, throwing them a whole bag of bones to keep them occupied. Mrs. Sinclair was sure that if there was a next time, her golden retrievers would almost welcome the robbers back into her home with open arms, hoping for some more bones to chew on. I regret to say that although feathers were definitely ruffled in our community, I certainly believe my family conjectured, as is often the case with human nature, that we would never be robbed. The fake security our alarm system provided for us left us falsely assured that we wouldn't be burgled. Isn't that so typical? I think we had the intrinsic warped belief that bad things happen to someone else and not to us, which is both irrational, nonsensical, and completely bizarre. I mean, how ridiculous is that? It's someone else that has a car accident, someone else who gets a rare deadly disease, someone else who gets run over by a bus. I think it may be the way we are naturally hardwired, to absolve ourselves from being tormented by the worries and afflictions that the likelihood of those things happening to us would bring about. Nobody wants to believe it would happen to them, but to us it most certainly did happen. I remember it was a Friday night. It was about 10 to 12 when I thought I heard a crashing sound. Much like our neighbour Felicity Kendall, we also owned a cat called Gurlane. Well, actually, she was mine. She was a grey cat with white socks on her paws, so agile, pretty and slight. But she was constantly on the prowl for mice in the early hours of the morning. She was a formidable hunter. I often woke up the following day to find carcasses of dead mice littering the underside of my bed that looked like a war zone, as my cat had spared no mercy to any of the victims of her deadly assault. I believe she brought those mice to me as little gifts, as Gurlane was obviously my cat. I gave her the name after my mother's skincare products when I read the name on the bottles. I thought it was so pretty, so my cat is named after an illustrious, very posh Parisian cosmetic house. Anyway, after the crazy crashing sound, I perceived it must be Gurlane, up to her old mischief again. Indeed, so did my parents reach those same assumptions, as my mother said to my dad, "Oh, that damn cat." The next thing, the alarm was activated. It began roaring through the house. The deafening noise almost made me jump out of my skin. I could hear my father in the landing saying, "Calm down, everyone. I'm sure it's a false alarm. Gurlane has knocked something over, activated the sensor. I'm sure of it." I groaned, pulling the duvet over my head. I must have fallen right back to sleep. I woke up later to go and get some milk from the refrigerator, as I was suddenly gripped by an inexplicable thirst. I was walking down the staircase, only to find my father lying on the floor in a crumpled heap at the bottom of the stairs. At first I was so shocked, I thought he was dead. I remember just standing there on the steps, unable to move a muscle, frozen in terror. Then I let out a shrill, ear-piercing scream that had my mother dashing out of her bedroom as fast as she could, darting down the staircase. She also began to scream when she saw my dad lying there at the bottom of the stairs. At first we both assumed my dad was dead, but we soon quickly realised he had a nasty gash to the head, and he'd been knocked unconscious, but he was breathing, so he was rushed to hospital and was let out later that day with a slight concussion. He was told he need only return if he experienced bouts of dizziness, thumping headaches, and blurred vision. It transpired that he went downstairs to deactivate the alarm system, and as he was returning up the steps back to bed, something or someone thumped him hard on the back of the head with a crowbar, or something exactly like that. He couldn't be sure. He said he could feel himself falling. Then everything went terribly black, and he remembers nothing after that. We were to discover that quite a few of my parents' antique collectibles, silverware and Royal Doulton pieces had been seized. Of course the police came to visit our family, asking us all kinds of curious questions that none of us could answer. I mean, we could hardly give any account of the robbers when we hadn't seen or rarely heard much. I could tell by the policeman's sober expression that they were getting more than a little flustered by the progressive ongoing burglaries in our street. After my father's thump to the head, people became worried that these burglars were turning dangerously physical. Sooner or later, someone could end up dead. And then they did. Days later, it would seem that Felicity Kendall was found lying deceased at the bottom of the stairs with a revolver in her hands. Ostensibly, she must have approached the robbers with this revolver. What happened next is unlikely to fully ever be known. So now the robbers, whoever they were wanted for murder, although the coroner concluded that Felicity had fallen down the stairs, but there was the distinct possibility that she may well have been pushed, which left many in our neighbourhood more than a little nervous. We adopted Percival, her overweight cat, and pretty soon Percival and Gurlane were inseparable. Percival began to lose weight effortlessly, as Gurlane introduced the cat to the wonders of hunting, so now the dead carcasses of mice increased under my bed exponentially. Me and my best friend Jack Clarkson talked a lot about the robberies on our street. We regularly rode our bicycles down the smooth asphalt road. We saw a white van parked in our street, with two furtive-looking characters sitting in the front seats, watching the comings and goings on our street, and eating burgers. But whenever we looked their way, they would immediately rev up their engines and drive away as fast as they possibly could, behaving in such a suspicious way that their absurd, dubious behaviour certainly sharpened our attention. Jack and I emphatically believed they were behind the robberies in our street, as they would accelerate down the road so fast to get away from us, so unfortunately we never got a really good hard look at them. Jack believed that the robbers were young men supporting a drug habit. Of course I wasn't sure about that, but one thing we both noticed is that all the robberies were occurring along one side of the road that faced the woodgrove on the private land that was owned by the farmer. Jack fancied himself as a sleuth. He modelled himself after some of those Nancy Drew stories. He told me when he was grown up he was going to run his own private detective agency, where he was going to catch cheating spouses, fraudsters and robbers. I thought it was a swell idea. I told him that I also fancied being a private detective. Just because we are young doesn't mean we can't start sleuthing now, Jack had told me. We can show the police exactly how it's done. We decided to call ourselves the Jackson 2. I began to take down notes. To my amazement, I was to discover that the large wire fence that pinned in all the backyards on our street had a huge open gash in our fence that was so large and superbly obscured by the hedgerow that was growing rambunctiously in the front of the fence. It had also been put back so meticulously that unless you looked very closely, you wouldn't have known the opening was there. I'm sure that even my parents had no clue about it. Jack and I assumed that this was the way the burglars were entering the property, so it was firmly decided that I would keep watch on that fence from the upstairs window of my bedroom that directly overlooked the view of the backyard. It was decided that I would phone Jack on the cell phone if I saw the robbers, so that we could follow them together, surreptitiously find out exactly who they were, and then inform the police. A crazy plan, I know, but at that age the idea of catching the robbers seemed very appealing to the both of us. And as far as our safety was concerned, we didn't give that minor consideration even a fleeting thought. In truth, I guess we wanted to be the heroes in our small town. Let me assure you, just because you're 12 years old doesn't mean you don't have ambitions beyond your years. On the next few nights, I would set the alarm on my cell phone for every half hour, so I would wake up and keep a vigil on the fence. One night I saw the silhouettes of two men creeping through my backyard and discreetly tiptoeing past my house onto the street. The effortless way they were moving gave me the distinct impression that these men were young, possibly still teenagers or in their early 20s. I knew at once they had to be the robbers that had been burglaring our street. By the looks of things, they were in the middle of a robbery right now, at this exact moment, but I couldn't be sure of this fact. But let's just say whatever they were doing, they were clearly up to no good. I quickly threw on a pair of jeans, a sweatshirt and a pair of sneakers, tiptoeing along the landing. My sneakers were making such a terrible squeaking sound. I was forced to stop every second for fear of being heard by my parents. It didn't help that both the cats were on the hunt again, and on seeing me were rubbing their silken bodies against my legs, purring so profusely that I was scared they would waken the entire household. "I need to go," I whispered to them. I tiptoed down the ribbon of carpet of our sweeping staircase towards the hall, where the light of the alarm panel was still flickering. I disabled the 5-digit alarm system, which was easy to remember, as it was the date and year of my mother's birthday. When the alarm registered the disarmed signal, I stealthily tiptoed towards the kitchen, exiting the house through the kitchen door, turning the key in the lock very discreetly. Then cautiously I crept out of the house, ever grateful that both my parents could sleep through almost anything, so were unlikely to wake up in a hurry, unless both the cats managed to rouse them with their loud purring. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I quickly phoned my friend Jack, pressing the numbers down on my cell phone as fast as I could. Thankfully he answered with a rather groggy "hello," which suggested I'd woken him up out of a deep sleep. "I'm outside," I told him, "here in my backyard. I've just seen the robbers going through the fence into the street. Hurry, be quick." I could hear the excited tone in his voice. "I'll be there in a moment," he assured me, and he was true to his words. I almost wondered if he'd been going to bed every night in his jeans and sweatshirt in eager anticipation, because surely no one could move as fast as he had done. I met Jack behind the yard shed. His eyes were animated, gleaming brightly like twinkling stars. He was carrying a torch in his hands. "I feel it in my gut," he told me. "We're going to find out who these robbers are." We made our way gingerly through the fence that was left wide open. Obviously it was currently in use by the robbers. I was amazed to see a collection of stolen stuff, covered by a long black plastic tarp, directly outside the fence, obviously waiting collection. I realized in horror that these young men were clearly caught up in the middle of a robbery, but I couldn't fathom whose house they'd broken into, as I didn't recognize the items that had been stolen. I knew we were now on privately owned land, belonging to the farmer, and the only route we could take at this point was through the wood grove that was made up of mixed trees, from evergreens to dogwoods, oaks and red alders. "Let's go and hide in the woods," Jack suggested, "so that we can discreetly follow the men when they take one of the hiking trails." I did wonder if the robbers purposely selected a night with a full moon, as although it was dark there was just enough moonlight dancing through the firmament, casting its ethereal shadows through the canopy of the trees, which meant that one could see one's way relatively clearly. Having said that, it didn't make things any the less scary, as walking through the woods at night is not an adventure for the faint-hearted. It requires nerves of steel, real guts, for the forest exuded what I can only describe as a menacing, uncongenial ambience that caused my hackles to rise. The tall statuesque trees clustered together in convivial groups that appeared so congenial during the day, but seemed to morph into unsavoury, monstrous beings at night, as the soft breeze that blew against their boughs made them appear to have hundreds of octopus-like tentacles that could reach out and grab you at any given unfortuitous moment. It was like I could see things that weren't really there in my mind's eye, as if it was playing tricks on me, creating all kinds of vain imaginings, like I had done when I was a little girl. It didn't help that the shadows of the moonlight caressed the contours of certain trees in a soft light, which meant the forest felt as if it was alive, with hundreds of eyes just watching us everywhere. The smell of the forest was pleasant, but the familiar night sounds I was so well acquainted with that most often offered me a measure of reassurance appeared absent this night. That was when I heard the faint mumblings of 2 young men trudging through the forest. I could hear the distinct sounds of tree bark and leaves being crunched under hard rubber soles from walking boots. Jack and I quickly took cover behind a large oak tree, our ears cocked up like a dog's, as we listened and waited. I could hear male laughter. 2 men were standing in the forest, phoning someone. "It went well, bro. The family disabled their alarm system. Didn't reactivate it at all. Usual story. Possibly thought it was the wind. Well, yes, it is rather breezy tonight. And that can activate the alarm. We got through a window. No, they never heard a single thing. Slept through it all. I think we got some good stuff. Looks like it might be worth something. Well, yes, we have left the stuff under the black tarp as usual, so if you could come and pick it up in the ATV, that would be absolutely brill. Speak to you later, bro." The young man looked up at his friend. "So there you go. We're done for the night." He took out a packet of cigarettes from his top pocket and lit the tip, offering his friend one. The men stood there smoking for a while. I could smell the stench of cigarettes invade the air with a pronounced, distinct smell that had undertones that made me secretly suspect it wasn't just cigarettes that the men were smoking. "What's that?" said one of the men suddenly. "Did you hear it?" "Hear what?" said his friend. "Don't scare the bloody bejesus out of me."
What did you hear?" "That's the whole point," said his friend, taking another puff of his cigarette. "Have you noticed how bloody quiet it is in the woods, bro? It's never been like this before. Something doesn't feel right. I kind of feel as if we're not alone, as if we're being watched. Is this one of your sordid jokes, bro? 'Cause if it is, I ain't laughing. When you nearly dropped that plate on the floor this evening, I thought we were going to wake the entire household. Did you not notice they had a hamster on a wheel downstairs in the living room? They're probably used to him making such a racket during the night. Those things can be a hell of a noisy. I'm telling you, bro, my sister had one once. We could never get a night's sleep. Bloody nuisance he was." All of a sudden I could hear this strange thumping sound in the sylvan. Whatever it was, it appeared to be coming towards us. It was like this thunderous sound was bolting along at breakneck speed, like a herd of trumpeting elephants. Surely an ATV doesn't make a noise like that, I thought, determined to keep as still as I possibly could. While Jack appeared to be physically shaking, he was overcome by terror, perceiving that whatever was coming towards us, it was anything but good. I could hear the two men saying, "What the hell is that?" And then we heard these heavy feet getting closer, closer and closer. And you just knew without seeing anything at this stage that something ponderously big was making its approach. That was when I noticed the branch of a tree swaying up and down. Then we saw him. He was easily 8 foot tall, easily as wide and big. He could easily have been 700 pounds or possibly more. But I've never been good at estimating size. But make no mistake about it, this thing was monstrously huge. Its silhouette was very human, but it towered like a solid, burly tree trunk. It was covered in long flowing hair that seemed an inky black colour. It had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head, low slung on the shoulders, with a face that was so remarkably human that I was completely caught off guard. The two men who'd been smoking openly gawked at the creature, as if they were so stunned they were almost incapacitated by shock. It was then I realized what this creature actually was. It was a Bigfoot. It was definitely male, for the energy he exuded was powerful, lofty, commanding. The creature was furious. His anger was frenzied, as if the sight of the two men displeased him greatly. He began to roar at them. Let's just say that sound made our annoying, obtrusive home alarm system seem like a pretty tone in a musical box. The roar had the capacity to just go right through you like a sharp knife. One of the men said to his friend, "Run! He's going to kill us!" The creature grabbed one man, throwing him on the ground so hard that the man let out an audible groan. Then he grabbed the other man with another arm and also threw him onto the forest floor. That man also let out a painful, anguished cry. But I didn't get the impression the Bigfoot had killed the men. I think he had incapacitated them. Things were about to get more shocking than I'd anticipated, as the Bigfoot ran directly over to the trunk where me and Jack were hiding, as if he'd known we were there all along. I was so petrified. I thought the creature was going to attack us. I could feel I'd wet myself, as the warm trickles of my own urine dribbled down my legs. I looked at the Bigfoot with terrified eyes that were as round as saucers. Jack seemed equally as discomposed, as he was physically shaking like a blancmange jelly. Because let's not kid, this huge creature was literally the most intimidating figure I'd ever seen. To my amazement, the Bigfoot, whom had been so aggressive towards the two men, was like a lovable teddy bear towards us. As his demeanour changed quite profoundly, he exuded a protective, brotherly, nurturing energy, staring at us with warm, congenial eyes that seemed so incredibly kind and were terribly beautiful. It was then that I realized the Bigfoot had indisposed or immobilized the men briefly, like a taser gun, if you like, on our behalfs, as he seemed very determined to lead us to safety, assuming responsibility for us like a wizened elder. He gestured for us to follow him, leading us directly back to the gate from whence we had initially come, so we scrambled through the fence. Once he was perfectly satisfied we were indeed safe, he nodded at us, gliding away. For a moment Jack and I stared at each other in awe, so delighted that the Bigfoot had been so nice towards us, and moved by how protective he had been. "I thought he was going to hurt us," said Jack, "but tonight I feel we encountered an angel. He was incredibly kind." As you can imagine, I rushed home to tell my parents that there were two men in the woodgrove, seemingly unconscious. I told them the story, agreeing with Jack to keep our encounter with the Bigfoot secret, as Jack emphatically believed some people, if they learnt about it, might willfully hurt him, and we couldn't allow that to happen. He was our friend as far as we were concerned. You always protect your friends. I'm very glad to inform you, as we had initially suspected, the men were not dead, but badly concussed and bruised. They were arrested by the police and confessed to the spate of burglaries in our street, but they never breathed a word about their Bigfoot encounter to the police, probably due to fear of ridicule. They claimed they'd taken a beating from a black bear, which did puzzle the doctors, who said that it was an unusual bear attack if that was the case. The farmer who owned the private land, I gather, had 3 children all of his own, but his wife had fostered a difficult young teenager who was addicted to drugs. She was a kind woman who wanted to help a young man whose life was wrought with challenges. The trouble was her foster child was an obnoxious young boy, addicted to drugs. He was the one who was going to collect the goods in the ATV. I think he was about 18 years old. To support his habit, he had collaborated with 2 other young men in their early 20s who were equally dependent on drugs. One whose father was an antiques dealer, so he knew about valuable collectibles and where to sell them to fetch a tidy sum. So those young men were very selective and particular about what they chose to steal. They only stole from properties on our side of the street, due to the easy accessibility from our fence to the backyard. But the 2 men who engaged in the robberies had definitely been watching our street from a white van, the very van that Jack and I identified as suspicious. When asked if they'd killed the old lady, Felicity Kendall, they said that the nervous woman had pointed a revolver at them from the top of the staircase and was so frightened and overwrought she lost her footing and went flying down the steps. They were shocked to learn the old lady had actually died. As you can imagine, in our neighbourhood we were considered heroes for catching the thieves, in a manner of speaking. And believe it or not, today Jack really does run a very successful detective agency. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Fletcher wiped away the snow that had gathered on the wooden steps of the deck with his heavily gloved hand. Then he sat down on the step to stare out at the glistening white wilderness that stretched out before him, like a vast, interminable ocean of white. All that was needed were a couple of white polar bears, he thought, gliding across the snow with their substantial white paws, to set off this riveting Arctic scene to its ultimate perfection. He marvelled at how magnificently beautiful everything was, now buried completely, swathed resplendently with carpets of thick, sumptuous, gleaming snow, that in the first light of the morning cast ethereal, soft shadows that danced across the snow in a flattering, twinkling luminescence. It was like staring at an enchanting, picturesque winter wonderland, as even the clusters of trees on the perimeter of the clearing that fringed the outer boundaries of the wood grove were generously weighted down, richly adorned in icy crystals that sparkled like bedazzling, opaque Christmas ornaments. Fletcher pulled out the Cuban cigar from the top pocket of his green plaid shirt that was buried beneath the heavy contours of his thick sheepskin anorak that he was wearing. He let out a huge sigh, unwrapping the cellophane packaging, pushing the cigar between his puckered lips, lighting its tip with his lighter. He sucked in the aromatic tobacco, breathing out long wisps of smoke that almost froze as they vaporized into the icy cold air. He let out a large puff. Fletcher felt his stiff arthritic body, that these days seemed so rigid and tense, like some of the inelastic, taut, statuesque trees in the wood grove that were held to ransom at the moment, under the heaving, unyielding weight of the inflexible snow that graced their protracted boughs, physically begin to relax, as the aromatic smoke did wonders to his constitution, in the way that nothing else ever could. For indeed he didn't know what he would do without his Cuban cigars. They helped to take the edge off his tension, loosen his tight muscles, enable him to physically decompress like a rigid beach ball, just letting go of the cumulative air that it contained. It was Christmas morning. Fletcher felt a doleful melancholia, as Christmas had always been the most special time of the year for him, but not this year. This year Christmas was going to be a lonely, isolated, somewhat miserable affair. In normal circumstances, Fletcher, accompanied by his beloved wife Phoebe, would be visiting their children in New York. His daughter Christine would lay out a fabulous, sumptuous spread for them all, with all the trimmings, the most succulent roast turkey you've ever tasted, that was so juicy and tender that the white meat would literally fall away from the bone.
crisp roast golden potatoes, a velvety deep crimson cranberry sauce, chipolata sausages, bacon rolls, cauliflower cheese, Brussels sprouts anointed with a plethora of rich golden gravy, and let's not forget Christmas pudding, brandy butter, mince pies. Fletcher loved nothing more than being reunited with his family and staying at Christine's in her large grandiose New York apartment that was so lavishly decorated with no expense spared. It looked like an ornate suite at the Waldorf Astoria, where his 2 daughters and 2 sons, along with their wives and children, would gather together for a huge festive celebration year after year. But not this year. Things were very different this year. Christmas embodied so much to Fletcher. In his opinion, it was 1,000 times more spectacular than Thanksgiving. Since he was a little boy, he'd loved everything about Christmas, all that it represented: a humble stable, a heavily pregnant young woman, the treasured birth of the Christ child. For him, beyond the religious significance of this precious day in our illustrious history, Christmas also meant for him the bright sparkling Christmas lights of the city, the throngs of people, the fabulous atmosphere of the shops when you went purchasing Christmas presents, the thrill of buying a live Christmas tree that anointed the apartment with thousands of needles, the ritual of decorating the tree, hanging up the Christmas cards on long ribbons across the wall, placing the presents under the tree, watching his excited grandchildren hanging their red Christmas stockings onto the mantel, leaving cookies and milk out for a hungry Father Christmas. He adored the Christmas carols, the church services, the delicious eggnog, the Christmas mince pies, the bright laughter of children as they tore open their Christmas presents with rapturous glee, the family getting together to enjoy quality time. Of course, there were some things he didn't like about Christmas, and that was reuniting with Christine's husband. But there were some things you could never avoid. He knew for many Americans, Christmas could be wrought with stress when you had to interact with family members you didn't particularly like, who served to ruffle your feathers, rubbing you up the wrong way. For him, the problem relative in his case was his highly annoying, patronising son-in-law Godfrey, whom he didn't believe was worthy of his daughter Christine's undivided attention and loyal love, as he had his fleeting suspicions that there was certainly another side to Godfrey, a dark side, but he chose not to meditate on those discomposing feelings. In truth, he found the pompous man with his inflated, overbearing ego that was so enormous it would quite literally make a beached whale appear inconspicuous. He was arrogant, conceited, pretentious, swollen-headed, with a haughty superiority, as his years at Harvard had somehow given him the false, hubristic impression that he was far better than anyone else. It would seem from the moment Fletcher had met Godfrey, he hadn't liked the conceited man one bit. But what could he do about it? It wasn't his business who his daughter chose to marry. Some parents might have been thrilled for their daughter to have a successful fancy pants as a husband like Godfrey, a mover and shaker in high society, so to speak. But Fletcher did not like the man's shallow, elitist, boastful attitude, as everything about his son-in-law was fake in his opinion. Fletcher sighed warily as he drew in another puff of his Cuban cigar, reflecting that even Godfrey's insufferable contemptuous presence on Christmas Day would be so much more welcome than the lonely, isolated Christmas that he and Phoebe would be embracing this year. Unfortunately, Phoebe had recently taken a nasty, rather unfortunate tumble when she'd fallen down an escalator at the shopping centre before Thanksgiving. Her neck was now firmly secured in a neck brace. She had been advised that any form of travel was out of the question, and the couple needed to stay at home for Christmas. Of course, Fletcher knew the specialist was absolutely right, as Phoebe was not capable of travelling over long distances. Besides, her injury brought on a great deal of pain. So this was a Christmas with just the 2 of them. He chastised himself for his self-pity. There were people out there who were celebrating Christmas all on their own this year, others who were forced to work on Christmas Day, like restaurant staff, emergency workers, doctors, firemen, so much more. He had to be grateful for small mercies, as small as they may be. At least he'd be spending the day with Phoebe, his beloved wife of over 50 years, whom he loved with all his heart. It wouldn't be so bad, he told himself, but try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be the worst Christmas of his entire life, even though everything about this morning was indicative of a perfectly magnificent Christmas Day. But without the rest of the family,
It was sorely lacking its usual vibrant finesse and beguiling magic. Fletcher turned around to glance briefly at the wooden cabin, where he and his wife Phoebe had resided for the last 10 years. He never regretted the day he decided to buy the place. If anything, the cabin looked quaint and charming on this Christmas morning, its wooden roof richly swayed in thick layers of snow. "I'll do my best to make the day as pleasing as I can for my wife," he told himself. Phoebe was propped up on her pillows when he entered the bedroom. She glanced at her husband with sad, sorrowful eyes. "I'm so sorry, darling. I know how much it means to you to be spending Christmas with the family. I really feel I've let you down this year." "Don't be ridiculous, sweetheart," said Fletcher. "All I want for Christmas is you. And you and I are going to have a wonderful day. Besides, the good news is we'll be able to speak to the family on Skype, so it'll almost be as if they're here with us." "But I feel so bad," said Phoebe, her eyes filling with tears. "You're going to have to do all the cooking yourself. That's such a big ask for you. I so wish I could help." "It will be a challenge, but I'll do my damnedest to make a delicious roast turkey for the two of us. That reminds me, I'd better put it in the oven right now. It's one hell of a sizable bird. It's going to take several hours to cook." Fletcher went into the kitchen. He began prepping the potatoes, the Brussels sprouts, and the cauliflower cheese. He followed the instructions on a YouTube video, covering the turkey with streaky bacon, filling the cavity of the bird with a pork-based sage and onion stuffing. Then he placed the bird into the oven for the long roast. He looked out of the kitchen window to see a man's truck driving up to the cabin, rubber tires skimming and crunching the snow. Finally the truck reached a standstill, parking about 100 feet away from the cabin. He heard the sound of a car engine being switched off, doors being opened and slammed behind each other, as feet crunched snow under rubber soles. Then he heard those feet approaching the cabin, noting from his window that the two people were leaving two very conspicuous trails of footsteps in the snow, one pair very large, the other small. No one was more surprised to see two unlikely strangers in these parts than Fletcher himself. Who are they, he wondered, for he didn't recognize the people at all. The man looked to be in his late 30s. He was warmly dressed, holding the hand of what appeared to be a very cute 7-year-old girl, wearing a tartan dress and a warm red jacket. Her black hair was braided into 2 pigtails. They were both walking towards the cabin door, where the man proceeded to knock. Fletcher couldn't help noticing that the man looked deflated. He would recognize that look anywhere, as the man looked exactly how he felt, lonely and sad, as if Christmas offered him very little to be happy about. Fletcher went to the door and opened it. "I'm very sorry to bother you, on Christmas morning of all mornings," said the man. "I'm running low on petrol. I've barely got anything left in my tank. I know it's a big ask, but I wondered if you could take me to the gas station in your truck to pick up some more petrol." "Of course," said Fletcher. "I'd be glad to help. But why don't the two of you come inside for something hot? A cup of tea, coffee, a hot chocolate, some eggnog perhaps? After all, it is Christmas, and the two of you look very cold." "That would be very kind," said the man. "My name is Wallace, and this is my daughter Francesca. Oh, by the way, Happy Christmas." Before long, Phoebe, Francesca, Wallace and Fletcher were sitting by a crackling fire in the living room, enjoying hot chocolates and warm mince pies, watching the flames of the fire crackle and spit. "This is very kind of you," said Wallace. "I'm enormously grateful. We've been driving around in circles, looking for this little place we're renting for the week. We don't know Montana very well. We're from Idaho." "Where are you going for Christmas?" Phoebe asked. "Nowhere exactly," said Wallace. "We've hired a little cottage for a week somewhere in these parts, but we've been getting hopelessly lost. I've completely drained the petrol tank." "I see. So what are you doing for Christmas lunch then?" she asked. "Nothing really," said Wallace. "Unfortunately, Francesca's mother died this time last year from breast cancer, so it isn't an easy time of the year for us. It's hard for us to celebrate Christmas in the circumstances, so we're just taking it very easy." "I am sorry," said Fletcher. "I can imagine what you must go through at this time of the year. We are very honoured if you would consider spending Christmas Day with us. I'm not the greatest cook in the world, but I'll give it my best shot.
We're also not getting together with our family, as my wife's neck injury means that travelling in her state is pretty close to impossible. She can walk around and do easy things, but doing anything that puts strain on her neck is not advised. We normally spend Christmas in New York with family, you see."
Francesca's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Please, Daddy, please can we have Christmas lunch here with these really nice people? Please, Daddy, please." Her face almost seemed to beg her father.
"I don't see why not," said Wallace, "if you're sure it's not too much trouble."
"I tell you what, Francesca," said Phoebe. "You see that wooden chest over there? It's full of Christmas decorations. There's a white Christmas tree in there. Would you like to decorate it?" "Yes, please," said the little girl excitedly, bustling around in the trunk and pulling out all kinds of bright decorations and Christmas baubles and tinsel, her face positively glowing with enthusiasm. She looked like a girl who had been denied Christmas and now had been given it all back. Before long, Wallace and Fletcher were busying themselves in the kitchen, drinking eggnog, talking and preparing the Christmas dinner. Fletcher found that he and Wallace had a lot in common. Both were keen hunters and fishermen. They loved camping and hiking, so they began to talk about all their adventures, and the warmth of the conversation was infectious as both men laughed, drank beers, and busied themselves chopping herbs and carrots, making bechamel sauce for the cauliflower, and allowing the cranberries and sugar to burst and bubble away to produce the most gloriously velvety, vibrant, shining crimson sauce. As luck would have it, it turned out that Wallace was an excellent, superb cook. He'd worked as a chef in a top hotel in Idaho for many years, so his presence in the kitchen meant the food being cooked was raised from a level F- to an A++. The delicious scents of roasted turkey, herbs, melted butter, parmesan, caramelized ham wafted over the cabin. Fletcher felt his mood elevate exponentially as the cabin began to smell exactly like Christmas. It smelt even more delicious than Christine's kitchen smelt at this time of the year. It was like a miracle had transpired. Phoebe had put on some Christmas music, which lifted the ambience of the cabin, as everyone began to sing along to the music. Francesca was in her element, decorating the Christmas tree that Fletcher had not intended to put up this year. But by the time Francesca had finished, the Christmas tree looked radiantly beautiful as the Christmas lights flickered on and off. The little girl's eyes began to fill with tears. "What's the matter, dear?" said Phoebe, holding the little girl's hands. "Why are you so sad? Don't you like the tree? I know it's not real, but—" "I'm not crying because I'm sad," said the little girl. "I'm crying because I'm so happy. I never thought I'd have a tree this Christmas. And all this nice food you're cooking. Daddy's been too sad to celebrate Christmas, so I thought we weren't going to have one this year. We were just going to stay at that cottage and eat baked beans on toast. We weren't going to have anything special this year. I'm crying because I'm so happy." Phoebe gathered the little girl in her arms, kissing her forehead affectionately. "And what about presents? Were you going to have any presents this year?" The girl shook her head. "No." Phoebe told the girl to get a bag at the bottom of her cupboard. It contained some of the Christmas presents she was going to send off to her grandchildren in the new year. Now she had in mind to give a couple to the little girl, as she could always buy replacements for her grandchildren, but in her mind it wasn't acceptable for a 7-year-old little girl not to have a present at Christmas. She handed the little girl a big box tied with a purple ribbon. "Now that's for you," she said. Francesca's face brightened, as if she was unable to believe she was actually getting a Christmas present. She tore it open vigorously, with a zealous exuberance, squealing with such a bounteous joy when she finally opened the box, to stare at the most exquisite porcelain doll she'd ever seen. The tears poured down her face like raindrops. "It's beautiful! Thank you so much!" She rushed into Phoebe's arms, giving her the biggest bear hug. Phoebe felt an incredible joyful surge gushing through her heart, a profound, overwhelming feeling, such as she had never felt before. As the consummate gratification she felt for making this girl so thrilled at Christmas brought her a reward that triumphed any Christmas present she'd ever brought her rather spoilt, overindulged grandchildren, for this girl was so incredibly appreciative. "Daddy, look! Look what Phoebe gave me! It's the prettiest doll in the whole world! I'm going to call her Grace." "That's a very nice name," said her father.
looking directly at Phoebe and mouthing the words, "Thank you." Before lunch, Phoebe and Fletcher Skyped the family in New York. "Hello, Gramps," came his grandson's voice. "Look what Mummy and Dad gave me. It's a big truck. It's remote-controlled. It can drive anywhere I want it to go." "It's very nice," said Fletcher, chuckling. "How are you, Dad?" came his daughter Christine, looking into the camera at her father. Fletcher took the computer around the cabin, introducing his daughter to their two guests, the Christmas tree, the storm being cooked up in the kitchen. "I feel positively intimidated," came Christine's voice. "My Christmas spread ain't going to be a patch on that. You look like the chef from the Ritz has cooked your lunch today. You better not enjoy yourself too much, Dad, because if you do, you might never want to come up to New York again. But good on you, Dad. It sounds like you're having a whale of a time. I'm so happy for you." It was true. The Christmas that Fletcher thought was going to be a mundane, dull affair had been transformed into a grandiose occasion with lots of Christmas sparkle and cheer. The table had been beautifully laid with gleaming glassware, shining silver, starched napkins, candelabras filled with candles and flickering flames, along with crackers. The Christmas tree stood up proud and tall on the left-hand side of the mantel. The fire was crackling away happily in the hearth. It was fabulous having guests here on Christmas Day, giving other people a Christmas they weren't expecting to have this year, with the help of Wallace's expertise on the culinary stakes. The virtuoso, first-class, delicious meal that was served up more than excelled their highest expectations. Wallace carved the turkey to perfection. The food melted in the mouth. It was so delicious. Everyone raised their crystal glasses, cheering to wish each other a happy Christmas, and then bright colourful crackers filled with jokes and token gifts were pulled and snapped enthusiastically, while Christmas hats were placed on heads, and mouths tucked into layers, textures and flavours that were very satisfying indeed. "I can't tell you how grateful I am to have been invited to spend Christmas with you and your wife," said Wallace, a single tear spilling down his cheek. "You have no idea what it means to us. This would have been a very lonely, sad Christmas for the both of us, without your kind intervention." "Likewise," said Fletcher. "I'm very glad you came." After Christmas lunch, it was decided that Phoebe and Francesca would watch a movie together, while Wallace and Fletcher would take a leisurely walk into the woodgrove to work off their overindulgences at lunch. This was the first time that Fletcher had been at home at this time of the year. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they walked through the tall statuesque trees of the woodgrove, disturbing a few deer that scattered the moment they saw the two men. "I really love the snow," Fletcher told Wallace. "Nothing in the world beats a white Christmas." "I agree," said Fletcher. "Christmas is meant to be white. You've made this Christmas so special for my daughter. In truth, I didn't want to celebrate Christmas this year, as it's the anniversary of my wife's death today. She died a year ago in a hospital bed, so it kind of felt wrong to be celebrating. But I can see by my daughter's elated expression today, how happy she looks, that celebrating Christmas is very important to her." "Of course it's important for your daughter," said Fletcher. "It's terribly important for every young child. I can assure you of one thing, Wallace. That is, your wife would definitely want you to celebrate Christmas today. The last thing your wife would want is for you to be grieving her loss, even if she did die on Christmas Day a year ago. I haven't truly expressed my commiserations to you for losing your wife. It can't be easy, being a single parent, having to raise your kid all on your own. It's not an enviable task by any manner of means." "You're right," said Wallace. "My wife wouldn't have wanted us to be miserable today. No one appreciated Christmas more than she did. She adored going shopping, putting up the Christmas decorations, drinking eggnog, having parties with friends. In truth, I think she would have been bitterly disappointed with me, not making a big deal out of the occasion, failing to buy my daughter a present. All of which were very wrong choices on my part. I can see that now. There you are, then. I hope I've made my point. In truth, I thought Christmas without the extended family this year was going to be a non-starter. But your serendipitous arrival today has blessed us all with a fabulous Christmas, and having you here has made the day very special indeed. I now know more than ever that Christmas is all about sharing and giving, which is why it's a time of great joy." Furthermore, I know of nothing that gives me greater pleasure than seeing the euphoric expressions on my grandchildren's faces when they open their presents. And having your daughter Francesca here today, opening that doll, seeing her elated expression on her face, brought me exactly the same gratification that I get every single year from my own grandchildren. Possibly more so, as Francesca wasn't expecting anything, so she was on cloud 9 to get a present. She was so happy, and I can't thank you enough for that doll, along with the jigsaw puzzle, chocolates and storybook that you gave her. You were incredibly generous. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your generosity. It was nothing. It was a pleasure.
As they trudged through the snow, the soft light of the day was beginning to fade. The snow sounded crisp and brittle under their feet. A cold, invigorating wind blew against their anoraks, but both men thoroughly enjoyed the bracing elements, the crisp freshness of the air, the smell of the forest. Everything felt remarkably quiet, when all of a sudden Wallace noticed a dead deer carcass lying splayed out over the branch of an oak tree, with one of its back legs torn off, both its eyes missing, so that it was staring at them blankly with wide-open sockets, which did seem rather macabre. Also, weirder still, its head was facing the wrong way round. It appeared to be back to front, as if the manner of death had been a chokehold over the neck, and then a dislocation. To the surprise of both men, the deer was warm to the touch, as if it had only been recently killed. But what perturbed both men was that the carcass was hanging on the tree 5 feet off the ground, as most predators would eat the carcass from the earthen floor. And this was not Africa, where leopards were recognized for dragging their prey up onto a tree. Also, the way the eyes and legs had been removed were exceedingly bizarre. The manner of death nothing short of extraordinary, as no predators were known for dislocating the neck this way, although it was possible a bear could have done this, but bears were in hibernation at this time of the year. Fletcher knew he had never seen an animal killed like this before. He began to examine their immediate surroundings for whoever or whatever this carcass belonged to. Surely they wouldn't be far away from their food source. That was when both men discerned a trail of very large footprints. Fletcher looked up at Wallace with a bemused expression on his face. "You don't think it's a Bigfoot?" he asked. At that, Wallace's face broke out into a broad grin. "Don't be ridiculous. Those things aren't real, surely. And if they were, well, just supposing they were, wouldn't they have moved away to a warmer region, without the disadvantages of the snow, which would make finding food and keeping warm a continuous challenge for them, surely?" "Well, then explain the size of those footprints," said Fletcher, leaning down to examine the size of the feet. "They're easily over 18 inches long." Fletcher glanced at Wallace's expression, which paled. His face turned almost a ghostly white, almost as white as the snow. He looked nonplussed. "This is rather strange," he admitted. "These feet are way too big to be human. And look how the toe is splayed to the right at an odd angle. No one in their right mind would walk on the snow bare feet. And no human being has toes splayed out like this. No, these feet are far too big," he said, scratching his head. "I'm thinking—" "Yes," said Fletcher, his voice sounding animated. "You're thinking what?" "I'm thinking, what else can it be? It's got to be a Bigfoot." Both men looked at each other with wide, excited, incredulous eyes. Fletcher began to feel like a young boy all over again, as a thrilled sense of wonder coursed through his veins, like the waves of a choppy sea becoming more frenzied by an exuberance that could not be suppressed or contained. Indeed, so elated were the euphoric feelings that bounced inside him like a buoyant beach ball that he couldn't help himself from wobbling precariously like a blancmange jelly. But to the casual observer, he was possibly trembling from the cold. But nothing could be further from the truth. Fletcher's entire body was shaking from the sheer exhilaration of such an extraordinary discovery, as from this point in time he had never believed in Bigfoot before. He did know of a man in town, Carter, who claimed to have had a fleeting encounter with a Bigfoot 2 years ago. Carter had informed the entire bar about his strange anomalous encounter with a Bigfoot, and much as Fletcher rarely wanted to believe his account, the trouble with Carter was he was a notorious spinner of yarns, whom couldn't be trusted, so anything that came from his mouth he took with a pinch of salt. Many of the townsfolk had doubted his encounter to be legitimate,
But maybe for once in his life Carter wasn't fibbing but telling the truth. Carter was also only forthcoming about his story when he was in an inebriated state, or rather drunk. And although he was a great exaggerator and embellisher, nothing had changed over the years. Another likely sign that he wasn't lying about his Bigfoot story. He had explained that while he was washing the dishes in the sink at home, he'd seen this massive figure standing on top of his picnic table in the backyard near the fire pit. He had said the creature was like this big towering mass of black hair that was gargantuan in every way, but the shape of the creature was distinctly humanoid. He said he had a dish in his hands, and as he leaned towards the kitchen window, the dish flew out of his hand, crashing on the linoleum floor. He said in that second the creature's head had swiveled around to look in his direction. Then it had glided over to the kitchen window, pressing his large face against the window pane, staring in at him with deep-set, dark brown, curious eyes. Carter was so terrified he screamed, running into the bedroom, returning moments later to discover that the Bigfoot had long since gone. He went outside the house to investigate and found a huge foot impression in the soil just outside the kitchen window. "You know what this means," said Fletcher, finally returning to the present. "It means there must be a Bigfoot around here." Both men began to study the landscape, and that was when they noticed spirals of smoke gliding up into the sky. They moved towards them. They were to discover that between two undulating hills covered with snow there was a dip in the valley, and a fire was crackling away in the snow. Both men carefully descended down the steep hillock, moving cautiously towards the fire, with the stealth of a wild cat. And that was when they realized that against the other hillock, blending so seamlessly into the environment, was a vast igloo-like structure, built half a foot away from the fire. The structure was made up of twigs, branches, bracken and moss, and layered with snow, which they perceived was clearly a nest. Fletcher put his fingers on his lips, tiptoeing surreptitiously towards the structure, then crawling on his hands and knees. As he moved ever forward, he shuffled past the fire, hoping that the sounds of the twigs crackling away with the bright yellow flames would not alert whatever was inside the igloo to his presence. As he got close to the structure, he looked inside the opening. He could hear the sound of a creature snoring very loudly, and see a dense, burly shape lying in the structure, covered in long, flowing, dark hair. The two men quickly crept away, certain that they had discovered a Bigfoot. "You know what I'm thinking," said Fleming. "It's Christmas. We have tons of leftovers. Why don't we plate the creature a huge plate of food, come back and put it next to the deer on the tree? I'm sure that must be his carcass that has recently been killed. I mean, who can resist your good cooking?" So that is what both the men did. They got a box, filling it with mince pies, grapes, oranges, bananas, apples, walnuts, cookies, sliced turkey, ham, roast potatoes, cranberry sauce, roasted ham, and bread rolls. "I just feel that the Bigfoot deserves to have a good Christmas like we have," said Fleming. "We all overindulged ourselves. Christmas is all about spreading the goodwill and the cheer." So they decided to place the box of goodies right next to the dead deer, as they didn't want the Bigfoot to know they had discovered his or her nest. The two men returned to the cabin to enjoy some eggnog and warm mince pies. They chose not to share their strange discovery with Phoebe and Francesca, believing it for the best not to say a word. If he had been spending Christmas in New York with his family, he would have never had the pleasure of meeting Wallace and his daughter Francesca, or being able to extend the generous loving arms of hospitality to two people who were not going to celebrate Christmas at all. It had felt exceedingly fulfilling to entertain two strangers in their cabin. A 7-year-old girl who had reconciled herself to the fact that this Christmas no presents were going to be forthcoming or to grace her Christmas stocking this year. The young girl had been surprised into having a fabulous day, along with Christmas presents she had never anticipated receiving. He was contemplating all this when he saw a dark, shadowy figure moving towards the cabin, stopping short in surprise to see Fletcher sitting on the steps smoking a cigar. Fletcher realized with astonishment it was a Bigfoot. Over his arms he carried half the carcass of the deer that he had previously killed the day before. For a moment he locked eyes with Fletcher. The Bigfoot was easily over 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and definitely a young male. Fletcher was struck by how human his face was. The creature brought the deer carcass a foot away from where Fletcher was sitting on the step, putting it down cautiously on the ground. He nodded at Fletcher, pointing at the carcass and then back at him. implying that it was a gift. He then glided away, and as Fletcher watched him move, he looked as if he was floating on the snow. Fletcher had to pinch himself. Was he dreaming? No, he certainly was not. He was soon to realise the creature had gifted him back after they had left him a box of food on the tree. My God, I've seen a Bigfoot, he thought, close up and personal. How many people get to have a Christmas like this? Fletcher took in another puff from his Cuban cigar, deciding that this indeed had turned out to be the best Christmas he'd ever had. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The cosy little cafe was bursting with activity, which was relatively normal for the lunch hour rush. The bustling, busy waitresses, clad in black with white aprons around their middles, were run off their feet, taking orders from hungry, demanding customers. You could hear the background sounds of men and women talking garrulously, in high and low voice tones, along with the clanging of cutlery, plates, and the tinkling of glasses. It was a quaint little cafe in Portland, highly esteemed and renowned for their legendary light snacks. The pièce de résistance being the most extraordinary, unsurpassed toasted cheese that would arrive on a plate, puffy, crisp and light, filled with sauté onions, crispy bacon, and a faint taste of beer on the tongue. It was the most sought-after illustrious snack at the cafe, which meant many of the locals called the cafe the Toasted Cheese Place. Everyone knew exactly what you were talking about when you referred to it like that. Claudia was wiping her hands against the white apron wrapped around her black jeans. She was feeling more than a little flustered, really rather frustrated, as nothing was more infuriating than customers willfully keeping you waiting. She had been making repetitive trips to table number 5, raising her voice as loudly as she could, several times to take their orders, but they had barely noticed her presence, as they were so entwined and keenly engrossed in conversation. She decided to try again, taking a deep breath, bracing herself to being rejected yet again. Excuse me, are you ready to order?" she asked, raising her voice, but once again she was met with a wall of silence, as the 4 customers were talking with a sedulous earnestness, failing abysmally at even noticing her presence at the table. Claudia decided they were definitely siblings, or at the very least related. They all possessed exactly the same olive green eyes, thick dark eyelashes, long Irish faces that reminded her of Sigourney Weaver's look in her younger days. One of the girl's hair was dyed a bright green colour, swept away from her face, tied in the back in a tight little knot that looked really rather fetching. "Excuse me," she asked again, "are you ready to order?" But once again no one responded to her desperate pleas for attention. "But I don't understand. What could have happened to her?" said the young man, whom Claudia decided was particularly handsome, with his honey-coloured skin, curly locks of dark brown hair, which gave him a rather angelic look, she thought. "You don't understand," said the girl with the green hair. "Come on, Oliver. Isn't it obvious? Dad finally went too far this time. His temper got out of hand. He lashed out, and then—" "Then what?" "Well, he did her in. Not on purpose, of course." The other young man intervened in the conversation. "Jane, are you completely nuts? Dad might be many things, but he's not a murderer." "Then explain why Mum has been missing for 3 days, and Dad doesn't seem at all concerned." "Because that's Dad for you," said the young man. "You know what he's like. He never worries about a single thing. He never ever has. If Mum goes away for a few days, he doesn't bat an eyelid. He's always been insouciant and carefree like that." "I say we call the police," said the other woman. "I think we should file a missing persons report as soon as possible." At that, the girl with the green hair flared up, rather like a protective dog, ready to lash out at her sister. She almost growled in her disapproval. "Involve the police? Are you stark raving mad, Jennifer? We don't need them sniffing around the place like a bad smell." "Just supposing. And listen, I'm saying supposing, so don't blow my head off again when I say this. You know what Dad's like. I know he's a lovable teddy bear most of the time, but let's not kid. When he gets a little heated under the collar, he can blow a fuse. So heaven help you if you get caught up in the firing line.
Just imagine if he accidentally lashed out at Mum. Maybe he pushed her down the stairs. Dad is a bull in a china shop sometimes, really cloddish, clumsy, ungainly." "You think Dad has killed her, don't you, Jane?" said the young man called Oliver. "You think he's only gone and buried her under the patio or in the backyard or something?"
"Well, it's a distinct possibility."
For a while everybody was silent, as if they were processing the ominous, baleful, inauspicious words that no one wanted to be thinking. For the 4 kids, the very thought that their father could have killed their mother in a heated moment sent shivers of impending dread down their spines, leaving all 4 siblings shuddering in dismay, barely able to conceal their rising level of angst, as all 3 green eyes glinted with a worry that was easily discerned by Claudia. This was the perfect, quintessential time for her to take down the order, but she was so entranced and engaged in the conversation that she continued to listen, as no one had noticed her standing there eavesdropping on what was to date the most interesting, intriguing conversation she'd ever heard since she'd started working at the cafe. "Well then, what do we do about this?" said Oliver, his furrow crinkling in hundreds of worry lines. "Supposing Jane is right, and Dad has accidentally killed Mummy. We need to protect him. We can't let the police know about this under any circumstances. Let's not kid. They wouldn't see this as an accident. They'd lock him up and throw away the key. He could be in prison for life. That would destroy him. It would break Mum's heart if that were to happen to him."
"Why are we all assuming and audaciously presupposing that Dad has fortuitously killed Mum?" said the other girl with the long brown hair that cascaded beyond her shoulders in a glorious fountain of gleaming locks. "It's so typical of you, Jane, to be so melodramatic, to immediately unabashedly launch into worst-case scenario without giving poor Dad the benefit of the doubt. Mum could be a legitimate missing person. I mean, hundreds of people go missing every year here in America. It's an established fact. Everybody knows this."
"Well, more to the point," said Oliver. "You spoke to Dad, Jane. What did he have to say to you?"
"Well, you know what Dad's like. He was nonchalant, dispassionate, as cool as a cucumber. He said that Mum had been gone for 3 days, that maybe she'd simply hired an Uber, visited her sister Ruth. But I phoned Ruth. Ruth told me that Mum hadn't visited her. So then where is she? That's the $101 question."
"Well, it's a pity Mum doesn't drive," said Oliver. "At least we would be able to discern by her car whether she was still on the farm or whether she went somewhere and never returned."
Jane looked up to see Claudia standing there with her pen and paper. "Let's order, everyone. We're keeping this poor waitress waiting." "I think we'll have 4 of your toasted cheese and 4 Mountain Dews," she said to the waitress. "Is everybody happy with that?" Her sisters and brothers nodded. Claudia then nodded, scurrying away, wishing she hadn't been spotted standing there, as she had thoroughly enjoyed listening in to the conversation. She was wondering what could have possibly happened to their mother. Was it really possible that the father had accidentally killed her, panicked and buried her under the patio or in the backyard? You heard of things all the time like that. Even the stats revealed that you had more chance of being killed by someone close to you, a family member even, rather than by a random stranger. She could discern the siblings absolutely adored their father, but his blasé, apathetic and indifferent attitude over his missing wife surely was a red flag to them, she thought. But then what did she know about murder? Claudia quickly returned to the table with steaming hot plates of puffy melt-in-the-mouth toasted cheese, garnished with sprigs of parsley and a side salad, along with frosted glasses of Mountain Dew.
"Jane, I think you need to go and speak to Dad. Find out what's going on. You've always been more forthright than the rest of us, but keep us posted as to what is going on," said Oliver.
"Will do so," said Jane, thanking Claudia for the toasted cheese. "These look scrummy," she said. "Oh, our toasted cheese is very famous here," said Claudia, smiling. "Please all enjoy." Jane's account. Jane sat in her truck, feeling so frustrated. She pulled back her green hair, undoing the knot and refastening it again. Something she always did when she was nervous or rather on edge. Some might reach for a cigarette to calm their frazzled nerves. Jane tended to play with her hair. As odd as it sounds for her, twiddling her hair around in her fingertips,
rarely did relax her significantly. She had organised the meeting at the cafe in Portland to discuss the plight of her mother, but it hadn't gone down very well with her siblings as she had hoped. Of course, everyone thought she was being scandalous, going beyond the pale, discussing the high probability of her mother being accidentally killed by her father. Everyone thought she was blowing things way out of proportion. But then where was her mother? People didn't randomly disappear for 3 days at a time without getting in touch, did they? Jane's father was the most wonderful man, but he was tall, ponderous, and rather heavy-handed in his body, a little like the Incredible Hulk, as he was well over 6 foot tall, very stockily built. It was almost as if he had never fully grown into his body, and was oblivious to how his ungraceful great size could cause a great deal of damage if he wasn't very careful. Indeed, her maladroit father had been known to ungainly walk into tables, breaking glass vases, ornaments, window panes, and glass tabletops without much difficulty at all. He was the kind of mellow, chilled, affable man that was so easygoing and relaxed he wouldn't bat an eyelid if you didn't return home for a couple of days. Growing up, her mother had found her husband's nonchalant, warm-hearted approach to child-rearing completely infuriating at times. She did not know a husband like him, who didn't worry at all about his kids. Why was he so unfazed about the kids when they didn't return home from a party in Portland? She'd be the one frantically worrying, while her husband would always look at her with a perturbed expression on his face and say, "Why are you worrying about something you can't control?" He was the one who thought his wife's behaviour was irrational, not the other way round. He would argue that people were responsible for themselves. Worrying about their whereabouts was a complete waste of time and energy. It probably explained why her father had normal blood pressure, not a single grey hair on his head, and a forehead completely devoid of worry lines, while her mother had a full head of grey curls. It was clear that in their relationship she was the one that did the worrying for the both of them. There was one contentious issue as far as Jane was concerned in regards to her father, and that was when he lost his temper, which was thankfully a rare occurrence, as it scarcely ever happened. For indeed it was true that the unruffled, placid Lawrence barely ever got mad. But should he get provoked for some reason, he could seriously overreact. His huge, uncoordinated hands would go swinging around the place like an octopus, oscillating his tentacles. But the problem was that Lawrence was not malleable, elastic, flexible, or pliable like an octopus. So if he thrashed out at you with his powerful fists in an irked frenzy, accidents were more than likely to happen. So heaven help you if you got caught up in the crossfire. On 2 occasions he'd lashed out at the wall, but inadvertently hit his wife fallaciously, causing her to fall quite badly. He hadn't intended to even touch her. "Lawrence, why do you have to be a bull in a china shop all the time, when your feathers get ruffled?" his wife had complained bitterly. "Is there no way you can stop throwing your arms around the place? You're like one of those humongous, frenzied, lovable dogs that impetuously knocks everything over in his path, causing a tsunami of devastation in its wake. You seem to fail to see how big and cumbersome you are. You break everything you touch, but things are replaceable. But I'd like to tell you, Lawrence, your children and wife are not. So if you break us, you can't just go and buy new models of us." As Jane sat back in her gleaming white BMW, she imagined whether her father might have killed her mother inadvertently. I mean, these things happened. There was no point in beating around the bush, talking in circles like her siblings always did. You never got anywhere with that approach. No, she needed to be direct with her father, to the point of being candidly blunt and brusque. She'd say it as it is in a forthright, undiplomatic way. "Dad, did you kill Mum unwittingly? I know you wouldn't have done it intentionally, but please tell me exactly what happened." Of course, her siblings would be appalled with her being so forthright, but as usual, her father was so perfunctory and lackadaisical about his beloved wife being missing for a couple of days. In his mind, his wife had gone off to visit her sister, but Jane knew very well her mother never just disappeared without telling anyone where she was going. She wasn't like that at all. Jane put down her foot on the accelerator, making sure to keep her driving at a safe speed. She drove to the family lavender farm, which was about 4.5 hours from Portland, not too far from the town of Jacksonville in Oregon. Before long she was driving down the country roads, familiar stretches of land that brought warm, wistful feelings of nostalgia back into her heart.
Sentimental, evocative feelings of her blessed childhood, as this was the part of the world where she'd grown up as a young girl. She drove past pretty barns, fields of black and white dappled cows grazing happily in the pastures. Then she finally was driving on the dusty dirt road that led to her father's lavender farm, where the family distilled lavender essential oil for a living. She felt heartily annoyed that the road had not been paved with asphalt, as it was as dusty as it ever had been, so her rubber wheels were lifting up smoky mists of dust. Finally she reached the wooden farm gate, posted Lavender Hills Farm. She drove down the long asphalt drive, her nose hit by the rich fragrant smell of lavender that she adored so much. She emphatically believed that one of the quintessential reasons for her vibrant health was having been surrounded by the fields of lavender every day of her young life. Some people joked that the lavender oil was the very reason their father Lawrence was always so relaxed and perpetually wore a broad grin on his face, as lavender is known as a powerful sedative with mood-enhancing benefits. Ostensibly, sleeping in the Collandier household had never ever been a stumbling block, as the entire family literally slept like babies. But Jane had almost certainly noticed that when she was away from home she suffered from insomnia, so she was certain the air filled with the fragrant bouquet of lavender had always ensured her an excellent, undisturbed, peaceful night's sleep. The farm looked absolutely radiant as usual, as if it was smiling at her, welcoming her back home. The most beguiling fields of purple stretched out over vast squares of land, the soft shafts of sunlight bespeckling the valley in a pretty luminescence of an arresting new day, while the tall trees that framed the boundaries of the lavender fields in rich shades of viridescent greens complemented the vibrant purple colour most favourably. Those majestic trees she loved so much sprawled out generously into a vast sumptuous wood grove with statuesque trees that rose up into the sky like imposing giants that were so impressive to behold. Jane sighed with delight. Slamming the door behind her, she was greeted to a sea of wagging tails, excited barks, but the dogs had been well trained not to jump up on people, which she was relieved about, considering she was wearing a white dress. She could see her father walking down the step towards her with a broad, cheeky grin on his face. "This is a lovely surprise, Jane," he said, wrapping his arms around her in a warm, affectionate hug. "What brings you home to the farm?" "I'm worried about Mum. I've heard she's gone missing for 2 to 3 days. "Oh, that," said her father, giving her a grin. "I spoke to you about that already. You worry far too much. You know your mother, Jane. She's so impulsive. My guess is she's gone to visit her sister Ruth." "Dad, I'm being deadly serious now," said Jane, growing visibly annoyed. "This is your wife we're talking about, my mother. For your information, Ruth has not seen Mum recently. So the big question is, where is she?" At that, her father raised a brow. "Funny. You do surprise me. I thought that she might be at Ruth's. I wonder where she's got to." "Dad, you haven't done anything to her, have you?" she asked him gingerly. "I'm sorry to have to ask, but I need to know." "What are you implying, Jane?" said her father, growing indignant and chagrined. "You think I've bumped your mother off, is that it? Buried her here in the yard? Is that what you kids really think about me?" "Well, Dad, I just want you to know that whatever has happened, we are 100% behind you. All of us are. You know we are. We understand that accidents happen. And let's just say this without putting too fine a point on it, Dad, but you are a tad clumsy, always bumping into things." "Well, that's very nice to know, dear, that you have my back," said her father sarcastically. "Dad, you know what you're like. I keep saying you're big and clumsy. When you get angry, you start boxing the walls. Sometimes you're so cumbersome you end up hurting anyone in the crossfire. You could have accidentally killed Mum, panicked, and buried her." Jane's father studied his earnest daughter in horror through his olive-green eyes, framed by thick dark lashes that only served to accentuate the depth of their greenness. He hardly dared to believe what his daughter was implying. Did his kids really believe he was capable of killing their mother, the quintessential love of his life, the woman who made his life richer and more beautiful by her mere presence?
Just because he wasn't concerned about his wife's whereabouts at the minute, his kids now suspected him of foul play. If Jane thought he was guilty of this duplicity, then he assumed so did all his other children. It mortified him to think that they could even conceive that he of all people could have done away with his wife. The mere thought was nonsensical. It should be a source of great offence that his kids would have such a low opinion of him, he thought. Jane, I can't believe you would even suggest. But Dad, we know what you're like. All of us do. But the police don't. Imagine if you were to report Mum missing now. They'd think that you had something to do with her disappearance. You'd become their prime suspect. Why are you overreacting, Jane? Your mum's only been gone for 2 or 3 days. Maybe she wanted a break. Maybe she's booked into a cottage by the coast. I wouldn't begrudge her doing something like that. I am Eleanor's husband. I'm not her keeper. So she's just bogged off to the coast, has she, Dad? Without telling you? That's a crazy idea. You know it is. You know that's not like her. Your mother doesn't have to tell me everything she does. Oh, Dad, you're so exasperating. You never worry about anyone, but you should be worried about Mum. Supposing something terrible happened to her. Imagine if she had a catastrophic accident. Lawrence tried to digest everything his daughter was saying. He'd always emphatically believed his family overreacted over the most insignificant things. In his humble opinion, this situation was no different. If his wife had taken off 3 days, that was her business. But why were his kids making a song and dance about it? He was absolutely certain his wife would return home safe and well, as she always did. He'd never worried about things like this in his life. But his daughter suggesting his wife could have been involved in an accident suddenly made him feel quite queasy. He'd never entertained such unsettling, discomposing thoughts before. But now, for the first time in his long life, he was beginning to feel unhinged. Dad, where did you see Mum last? I want you to think very carefully about this. I think she mentioned she was going for a walk in the wood grove. Well, we need to go and find her. Lawrence needed little encouragement now. Suddenly his apathetic attitude was overtaken with a grievous concern. Imagine if Jane was right. Imagine if his wife really was in trouble. Eleanor's account. I'm going for a walk, darling, she said, blowing Lawrence a big kiss. I need some fresh air. Actually, I'm gagging for it. I felt cooped up indoors after all that torrential rain we've had recently. What are you telling me for, sweetheart? You know you can do what you want around here. We never stand on ceremony. You're as free as a bird. Since when have I ever clipped your wings? Since never, said Eleanor, although it would be good if you were worried about me a teensy-weensy bit, she teased. Worry about you, laughed Lawrence. Why would I worry about you, dear? You're perfectly capable of looking after yourself. I never have to worry about you. Eleanor smiled as she walked through one of the fields of lavender towards the wood grove. One thing about growing lavender for a living was that she was always in a good mood. When she had married Lawrence all those years ago, her health had radically improved exponentially, which she put down to the healing powers of the essential oil that infused the air that she breathed every day of her life. Eleanor never failed to stop marvelling at the oceans of lavender, flowers that stretched out before her in resplendent carpets of purple. There were bees buzzing around the plants, colourful butterflies darting from one flower to another. She breathed in the heady, full-bodied, provocative fragrance, delighting in the rich, intoxicating, potent smell. Who would have thought she'd have ended up marrying a lavender farmer, she thought to herself. Lawrence was the perfect husband. He'd never worried about a thing, while Eleanor had come from a background in which her parents were always frantically worried about absolutely everything. If she had been 5 minutes late as a little girl for anything, her parents would have panic attacks, thinking that she'd been caught up in a deadly accident or something quite catastrophic had happened to her. It was hardly a wonder, she thought, that by the time both of her parents were in their 30s, their hair had turned as white as snow. By the time they'd both reached their 50s, they'd both died of sudden unforeseen heart attacks. Eleanor knew in her gut that the root cause of their sudden fortuitous demise was their incessant worry and stress about absolutely everything you can think of. She emphatically believed that she and her two younger siblings, Mark and Alexia, had caused her parents so much stress growing up, resulting in them both having soaring high blood pressure, high cholesterol and diabetes. The doctor had informed her mother Elaine that if she didn't calm down and learn to relax, she would invariably end up having a heart attack, and lo and behold, that is exactly what had transpired. When Eleanor had met Lawrence for the very first time, she had been attracted and charmed by the very tall, ungainly man, who didn't seem capable of worrying about a single thing. She found his carefree attitude to life, his inability to get stressed about anything, so refreshing, intriguing, and somewhat bewitching. He had been good for Eleanor, for she knew that Lawrence's calm demeanour had rubbed off on her over the years, significantly calming her down. She was ever grateful that if she got in her truck and went away for a couple of days without even informing her husband, he wouldn't even bat an eyelid or worry about her at all. He would know that she was perfectly all right, although there was a small part of her that wished he'd worry just a little bit. Supposing one time she really was in trouble, she pondered, and Lawrence had no comprehension that she needed his help. Some people would misconstrue her husband's indifference to her whereabouts as a husband who did not love his wife, but nothing could be further from the truth, for she knew no one could love her as much as Lawrence did, and as far as she was concerned, he was the love of her life. Eleanor made her way into the wood grove beyond being in the field of lavender. This was the most treasured place in the world to her. As a girl growing up, one of her most cherished, beloved stories was The Secret Garden, where 3 children discovered the delights of a magical garden hidden away from prying eyes. For Eleanor, the wood grove represented just that. To her it was a secret little favoured sanctuary, her special place. Over the years since her children had left home and were now working in Portland, the wood grove had become her most favourite little hideaway. She wasn't sure what it was that she loved about this tranquil, serene haven. She adored the remarkably stately-looking trees that were so old, so regal, so mature. They seemed like wizened friends who had been around for an awfully long time, even before she was born, which was a sobering, rather humbling thought. She delighted in the majesty, splendour, graceful repose of all the trees, the vast knowledge and sagacious wisdom she believed their long, rugged, rough-textured trunks contained. She delighted in their boughs full of glistening leaves. If that wasn't enough eye candy for you, she adored the soft earthen floor, along with the beguiling plants that grew beneath the trees, the feathery ferns with their lacy leaves, the different distinguished unique ground covers, the edible funguses, the rich verdant mosses that swathed the forest floor in glorious carpets of viridescent green. It was so magical the way the prisms of sunlight danced so daintily through the branches, dappling the forest floor in an ethereal, sparkling luminescence. As Eleanor walked into the wood grove, she smelt the pungent stench of cigarette smoke on the wind, which was strange, as no one should be in this wood grove. It was private land, property owned by her family. Her hackles immediately rose. Then she saw him, a bedraggled, sorry sight of a man, who in one gnarled, arthritic-looking hand held a cigarette he was clearly smoking, in the other a half-empty bottle of rum he was drinking. She noticed to her disgust there were several bottles of rum and whiskey strewn haphazardly across the ground, all empty. Eleanor marched towards the man indignantly. He looked to be in his early 60s, with a wrinkled, weathered face that had been overexposed to the sun, a scattering of silvery grey hair that was brushed over a rather bald scalp, as if to cover it. He was wearing shabby, soiled clothes that looked like he hadn't changed over many weeks. A vagrant, she thought to herself, and not a pleasant one at that. She felt angry about the stranger's brazen audacity. Who was he? What was he doing on her land like this? As she moved towards him, she was hit by the violent stench of human body odour, urine, and clothes that stank of cigarettes. She noticed he had rigged up a pop-up tent in the woods. How dare he be so brazenly presumptuous, she thought. Who the hell did he think he was? "Excuse me," she said, putting her hands on her hips in defiance. "This is private property. What are you doing on my land? You need to leave now. You need to leave at once." The man was clearly inebriated. She could see his legs were unsteady, wobbling beneath him. He began to chuckle as he smoked, occasionally taking a gulp of his rum. You're telling me to go, lady? I'm not going anywhere. You can't tell me what to do. I can tell you to leave my property right now. The man began to chuckle, as if he found Eleanor's protests highly amusing. You're a feisty thing, aren't you? He teased. I bet you're good in the sack. How dare you speak to me like that? Eleanor began to raise her voice. You get off my property right now. Do you understand that? You get off my property now. Leave now. The man's tone began to change. As his humour disengaged, he recruited anger towards Eleanor that caught her distinctly off guard. No one tells me what to do. No one. You bloody bitch. You bloody bitch. I know what you're like. You women, you're all the same. All the same. You think you can boss me around? Is that it? You get the F out of here. You think you can tell me what to do? The next thing that Eleanor knew was the man picked up a stone and threw it at her head. She recalls falling back on the ground. Everything went completely black. How long was Eleanor unconscious? She didn't know, but she woke up to find herself in a cave, where prisms of sunlight danced through the cracks of the stone, enabling her to see clearly, even though the light was faint. But it danced around the cave in soft shadows. She noticed the stone walls of the cave were tall as they were wide. Where am I? She thought, sitting up in surprise, looking down on herself to discover that she was laying on a straw and bracken bed that was covered in deer pelts. It was dark and cool in the cave, the floor carpeted also with deer pelts. Dried lavender hung on the walls of the cave, which made the place smell quite fragrant. It was certainly a cosy-looking den. She looked around, thinking to herself, where the heck am I? Her head was throbbing violently. She touched the sensitive, sore spot on her head, where it really hurt. She could feel a large swollen bump that was tender to the touch. She could see that the skin had been grazed, as if she must have been bleeding there, but it had obviously dried up. Then a memory came flashing back to her. Of course, that obnoxious drunk in the woodgrove. He'd thrown a rock at her. But how had she ended up here? Where was she? That was when she saw a dark shadow moving towards her. To her amazement, she found herself locking eyes with a female Bigfoot. Until this point in time, she had never believed in the existence of such a mythical creature. But now she was in no doubt that Bigfoot was real, unless the blow to her head had been so hard that she was now hallucinating. The creature looked directly at her through the kindest eyes Eleanor had ever beheld, then pointed to her head and said some strange words that Eleanor discerned was very much a language. Eleanor nodded. She said, "Yes, I do remember. I got hit." The creature nodded, as if to affirm what Eleanor was saying. She noticed that it seemed to have the ability to read her mind. The creature was different to what she would have anticipated a Bigfoot to look like. She had been under the distinct impression that they bore a remarkable resemblance to an ape. But this she did not think was the case. In her humble opinion, the creature looked like a giant human being, covered in long dark hair, the colour of coal, with overlong arms and a distinctive pyramid-shaped head. At a guess, the creature was easily over 8 foot tall, about 700 pounds, and was distinctly female, as she had rather drooping breasts that hung low upon her chest. The Bigfoot disappeared for a moment, returning with berries and a few apples. Eleanor was grateful, not being able to comprehend why she was so hungry. The creature, having read her thoughts, lifted up her fingers, pointing to her, raising 3 fingers, as if to say, "You've been out for 3 days." "You mean I've been here for 3 days?" gasped Eleanor. The creature nodded. Eleanor was absolutely shocked. She thought about Lawrence and smiled to herself. Thank God he wouldn't be worrying about her, she thought. She ate the apple and berries hungrily. Then she got to her feet, wobbling unsteadily, as her head was still throbbing. She moved towards the door of the cave, gasping when she realized how high the cave was off the ground. There was no way she could walk down this precipitous rocky outcrop without breaking her neck, she thought. You'd have to be as agile as a mountain goat to maneuver your body down this mountainous incline. The Bigfoot indicated that she would carry Eleanor, and she agreed to this. There was no way she could navigate her way down this outcrop. Besides, she didn't know where she was, as the terrain was unfamiliar to her. The very congenial, benevolent Bigfoot picked her up in her arms as if she was as light as a feather, and then bounded out of the cave, down the rocky incline, with efficiency and grace. Eleanor sniffed the Bigfoot. She had heard stories that they stank, but this wasn't true. She liked the smell of the female Bigfoot. She smelt of the earth and of lavender. Eleanor pressed her head against the soft hair and felt a warmth in her heart, as if she was swaddled and protected by the creature's love. She could feel the rise and fall of the Bigfoot's chest and hear the breathing sounds from her nose that rather reminded her of a horse. The Bigfoot glided gracefully with Eleanor in her arms to the wood grove that Eleanor loved and adored so much. She could hear the sounds of her daughter's voice calling her, so she indicated for the Bigfoot to put her down on the ground. Then she wrapped her arms lovingly around the creature, giving her a big warm hug. Thank you, she said. I can't thank you enough for helping me." For a second the two of them locked eyes. Eleanor saw that the Bigfoot seemed to be smiling at her. It then nodded. She watched it gliding away. What a magnificent creature, she thought. "I'm here, Jane," she cried out. Jane came running through the forest, racing towards her mother, enveloping her mother in her arms. "Mum, I thought you were dead," she cried with relief. Lawrence was smiling. "So there you are, my sweet darling," he said. "The kids thought I'd done you in, buried you under the patio." At that Eleanor burst out laughing. "As if your father would do that to me. Really, Jane?" "Well, he is very clumsy," said Jane. "He is that," her mother agreed. "And he never worries if you go missing, not even for a couple of days. That's not normal." "True," said her mother, "but I wouldn't have your father any other way." Jane pulled her cell phone from her pocket and sent an SMS to all her siblings. "Mum is safe and well." "Where have you been, Mum?" said Jane. "Wouldn't you like to know?" said her mother. "Let's just say if I told you my story, you'd be unlikely to believe a word of it." To this day, Eleanor does not know who the mystery man was that was dossing down in the wood grove, but she is ever grateful to a Bigfoot that rescued her in her impaired state, nursing her back to health. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I had reached a dark, tenebrous, desolate place in my life, but I concealed it remarkably well from my wife and kids, who were completely oblivious to my internal turmoil. Somehow, after my wife had given birth to a dead baby, which was to be our third child, I felt as if the wind had been ripped out of my sails. Being the man of the house, I had to be the tough one, resolutely determined and assertive, the one in the household as hard as nails, unyielding in my inner strength, holding everything up like the scaffolding in a flimsy building, so that our lives did not come crumbling down before us like a paper-thin pack of cards. You would think we had 2 children. Why would a third child being born dead be so devastating to our lives? But it really was. Seeing a perfect child that was born dead in my arms was not easy to accept by any manner of means. It truly felt personal, as if the hands of fate had dealt us a nasty, cruel blow. As a miscarriage earlier on in pregnancy, I could just about have handled, but not this. This was a harrowing, senseless torture, for I felt I'd lost a child as precious as my 2 other kids, who were very much alive. I couldn't get the tormenting, excruciating, painful images of the perfectly formed baby out of my head. I gave my wife all the encouragement and support I could, but on the inside I was dying, a very slow death. I had no idea I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. All I knew was I wanted out of my miserable life. I wanted to escape the hell on earth, the limbo I was experiencing, so that it would all just go away. Of course, I did have my fleeting doubts when I was seized with a hesitancy, almost like an internal nudge, telling me to quit while I was ahead. What if this wasn't all there was? What if I was to open my eyes in death? only to find myself in purgatory. Then I would have abandoned and forsaken one form of hell to enter another one. I will admit that I did try to end my life on multiple occasions. It may sound incredibly selfish, and it probably is, but I can't begin to describe the level of desperation I felt at the time. The need to release myself from the constraints and encumbrances of my life that was building up inside me like a pressure cooker waiting to explode in any given minute. I just couldn't hold it together anymore. I was falling apart, very much like a warped jigsaw puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together to make one complete whole. A little like the nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty. I was so broken, crushed, shattered and messed up, too much so to fix myself. I had in mind I would find a tree, climb it, throw myself off it with a noose around my neck, be done with it. But the raw, brutal truth was that when push came to shove, I completely chickened out. I didn't have the guts to take my own life. Then one day I had an inspirational epiphany that hit me like a lightning bolt of enlightenment. I decided that I would abandon my life, starting all over again. But in order to succeed, I had to physically and emotionally distance myself from thoughts of my wife and children. If I started again, I would be like a new person, with a clean slate, embracing a brand new beginning, and so that is exactly what I did. This was something I knew that I could do. I woke up very early in the morning, and I just disappeared, leaving my whole life behind me, my credit cards, car keys, cell phone, and everything. For the first time in my entire life I felt free, as the responsibilities and stresses of my life had finally been relinquished. I was born again to a new beginning. I would find myself again, leaving behind the old to embrace the new. But in order to succeed, dwelling on the past was a non-starter. Laura's story. I woke up early in the morning with the sun streaming through the bedroom, only to find that my husband's side of the bed was empty. I imagined he might have risen early to go for a walk, as his car keys were on the side of his bed, as well as his wallet and cell phone. He never went anywhere without those essential items. It was incredibly unusual for him to go for a walk, but there were occasions he was eager to embrace some fresh air. So that was ultimately what he must have done this morning, I thought. In the morning I dropped my 2 kids at nursery, returning home to find my husband still had not come back from his walk. By lunchtime I was beginning to get rather worried, growing increasingly concerned, especially when my husband's boss phoned, asking me where the hell Cameron was.
He's needed for this very important meeting with a client. It requires skilled negotiation. We need Cameron here right now to deal with these turbulent customers of ours.
I'm sorry, I said, but I don't know where he is. The next thing I knew was my life was thrown off course. The little boat of my life was now treading on tumultuous water, facing hazardous storms, as my husband did not return home. It would seem days passed as missing persons reports were finally filed. On 2 occasions I was asked to go to the police station to identify 2 separate dead bodies that had been recovered, but none of them, thankfully, were my husband. If that wasn't bad enough, my husband's mother and father, whom I'd never liked from the very start, began to accuse me of having something to do with his disappearance. Sandra and Pete arrived at my home while I bustled around the kitchen putting the kettle on. Sandra stood there with her hands on hips, looking at me through suspicious, jaundiced eyes that looked as sharp as daggers.
"What have you done with my son?" she demanded. "You must know where he is."
"Sandra," I piped, "I'm just as confused as you are. I've no idea where Cameron is. That's why I filed a missing persons report."
"Well, what happened? Did you have a fight? Did you go upsetting my poor son? I know what you're like. You're a loose cannon. Always invoking problems, you are."
"No, things have been going very well for us, Sandra, I assure you. Cameron and I did not have a fight, not like you're suggesting."
"Well, he must have left you a note or something. Told you where he was going, surely. He wouldn't just bog off like that. That's not like my son at all." "Maybe he left her for another woman," suggested her husband Pete. "Frankly, I wouldn't blame him if he chose to abandon you. In truth, I've never warmed to you, Laura, from the very start. Neither has Sandra. What our son ever saw in you, God only knows. We did try to warn him about dating a girl like you, let alone marrying one. But Cameron was as obstinate as hell, determined to tie the knot with you. You rarely had him wrapped around your little fingers. He didn't see through you like we both did.
Cameron hasn't left me, nor the kids for another woman, if that's what you think. He wouldn't do that to us. Well then, where is he? Said Sandra, wrinkling up her nose at me in disgust, as if I was a noxious bad smell she couldn't tolerate. What have you done to him? You've done something to make him leave. What do you mean, what have I done to him? Exactly what I'm saying, said Sandra. Do I need to spell it out to you, or are you really as stupid as you look? Did you hurt him, Laura? Did you hurt my son? Because if you did, I'll kill you. And I'm not joking either. If you laid a single finger on my Cameron, you're as good as dead. I'll bury you under the patio myself if I have to. What are you going to do? Threaten me, Sandra? You think I have the strength to bury my 6 foot 200-pound husband here in the backyard? Is that what you're implying? I wouldn't put anything past you. Something is very dodgy about all this. I know my son. He wouldn't just disappear like this unless you did something to him. And I don't trust you, Laura. I know you've done something to him. I'm not going to sit back and listen to your insane innuendos. Get out of my house! I grabbed Sandra by the collar of her shirt, moving her out of the front door, with her husband behind her. I'm going to call the police, said Sandra. I'm going to tell them what you've done to my son. You're a murderer. You killed my son. We're not stupid, Laura. I hope they lock you up for life. I hope they throw away the key. I slammed the front door behind me, clutching the door handle tightly to give me some inner strength. I locked the door behind me, falling back onto the floor, into a crumpled heap, bursting into tears. How long I lay there, I do not know, but I cried and cried and cried, until the reservoir of my tears had completely dried up, and I could cry no more. There was nothing worse than being falsely accused by my husband's parents of having something to do with his mysterious disappearance. That was beyond the pale. I didn't know how I could hold it together. I was barely coping, but immensely grateful and beholden to my mother, as my 2 kids were spending the next couple of weeks under her charge to give me some much-needed breathing space. I certainly didn't want them to see me in this emotional, overwhelmed state. Little kids are impressionable. It was important to be strong in situations like this. My little boy Dylan had been saying to me, "Mummy, where's Daddy?" I'd lied to him, telling him Daddy had gone away, but he was coming back very soon. In truth, I had no idea where he was. I had surmised he must have gone for a walk and had a dreadful accident, but I was hoping with all my heart he wasn't dead. But a small part of me kept going back to that grey area which would keep whispering to me, "But what if he is dead? What if he is dead?" I had been interviewed by the police, been asked about my husband's emotional state, how he had coped after my son's tragic death. Had he taken it badly? Was he suffering from depression? Was he suicidal? Those words had been like a vicious blow to the head. As far as I knew, my husband had handled our son's death remarkably well. He hadn't so much as shed a tear. He had been my tower of strength. The young policewoman who'd asked me these questions seemed sceptical and rather cynical that my husband hadn't been badly traumatized over our son's death. She sagaciously informed me that in her invaluable, expedient, salutary experience, working as an officer over many years, she had found men were very good at disguising their emotions. Maybe, just maybe, my husband hadn't been managing his emotions over this grievous time, she told me, as kindly as she could. But, I protested, he was so felicitous, inspiriting and reassuring. He helped me through this rough, dark time. I thought he was managing remarkably well. Your husband's abandoned his truck, his car, his wallet, his cell phone, and just vanished off the face of the earth? Men often do that when they're emotionally distraught. It's not normal behaviour for a man of sound mind. It is the behaviour of someone falling apart at the seams, cracking up in their lives.
You think he could have committed suicide? I asked in horror. Surely, surely not, I said, wiping away the tears that had gathered on my eyelashes, as the thought of Cameron committing suicide left a nasty, bitter taste on my tongue, and a hollow, vacuous emptiness in my gut. I'm just saying, Laura, that it's a distinct possibility. We have to look at all the options. We have to be pragmatic, shrewd, realistic, and level-headed. I need you to be strong, to prepare for any possibility or eventuality. We cannot sugarcoat things for you. Otherwise, if we do, you're not going to manage very well when you're forced to face what actually happened to your husband. I'm hoping he's absolutely fine. I'm hoping he'll be found safe and well. Of course I am. But we have to explore every avenue, leave no stone unturned in our search for your husband. And it's going to be a long, arduous process. But couldn't he have just had an accident? Couldn't he be suffering from amnesia? Forgotten who he is? That too is a distinct possibility. I don't dispute that for a moment, Laura. But as you know, the police have combed the woodgrove and all the hiking trails. We've had divers searching the local lake. We found no sighting or sound of your husband. But he must be somewhere. Of course he's somewhere, Laura. But I do need you to know that some people go missing in America every year and are never ever found. You also need to prepare for that scenario, because it could be weeks, months, even years before we find out exactly where he is. Sometimes this whole search for a missing person can be all-consuming. It can take over your entire life. But you can't let that happen. You have 2 kids in your charge who need your undivided emotional and financial support. When you say people go missing, are you suggesting he was abducted, deliberately harmed? All those are also distinct possibilities, said the policewoman. But there are some people that go deliberately missing, leaving behind no paper trail, so it's almost impossible to locate them. I know a vagrant who lives on the streets here in Denver. He ran away from his grandiose home in Atlanta. It all got too much for him. He is very happy now living on the streets. By all accounts, he's a highly educated man, with several degrees behind him. I was the one who had to contact his family, telling them that their father and husband was absolutely fine, but had no intention of ever returning home. He wants to remain here on the streets. But why would he want to do that? For all kinds of reasons. Sometimes to escape their lives, to enjoy a simple, uncomplicated life. It does happen when people become overwhelmed with responsibility, financial issues, emotional hazards, tumultuous challenges, personal relationships, personal tragedies and loss. A plethora of different reasons. Pretty much anything can cause people to abandon their old lives, to begin again. It's not as uncommon as you may actually think. Once the policewoman had left my home, I grabbed a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon from the fridge. I began to drink back the cool wine. It was amazing how the alcohol helped me to manage my frazzled nerves. What on earth had happened to my husband? Where the heck was he? If that wasn't bad enough, the very next day I was informed by the police that they had to search my yard. What for? I asked. Why? They explained they'd received a report that my husband might be buried in my yard. Of course I knew who had filed the report. It was my husband's parents. I mean, who else could it be? I felt utterly mortified to see my beloved garden being torn apart and dug up, especially one of my flower beds where I was recently growing some petunias that had only just been planted. The police later informed me that they were fully satisfied that there were no dead bodies in my yard, which I could have told them myself. I felt absolutely furious with my husband's parents, who clearly envisaged me capable of murdering my own husband. 2 months went by with no sign of my husband. I'd kept telling myself over and over again that he was alive, but I no longer believed that lie. I was beginning to have a sinking feeling that my husband was not ever coming back. In truth, I was beginning to think he really was dead. I was horrified when my little 4-year-old girl asked me just that. "Is Daddy dead?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart," I said. "He went on a journey. He may have decided to stay here on earth, or go to heaven. But if he did decide to go to heaven, he can't ever come back." "But why can't he come back if he goes to heaven?" because when you buy a ticket to heaven, you can't return. It's a one-way ticket. But why would he go there if he can't come back? Surely he wants to see us. You see, if you buy a ticket to heaven, I told my daughter, Daddy can see us from where he is, but we can't see him. So if you wave at him and say hello, and he's up there, he'll definitely see you. But that's not fair. I want to see Daddy now. She began to wave up to the sky. Daddy, if you're there, I'm just saying hello. My son Rory turned to me and said that his friend had told him that Daddy might have committed suicide. What is suicide, Mummy? He asked. It's when a person decides to go to heaven. They don't want to stay here, so they buy a one-way ticket to the invisible land up in the sky. But why? Asked my son. I don't know, sweetheart. Some people just want to leave this place sooner, that's all. So is Daddy never coming back? He asked me. I'm not sure, darling. I know it's very hard, but we'll have to wait and see. But you can always pray and ask God to help him to come back home to us. Will God listen to me if I pray? Well, I'm not sure, but it's worth trying. The Bible tells us that when we ask, we can receive, which means if we want something very badly, then we should ask for it. We're told that our Father in heaven will always hear us when we pray. So if I ask God to bring Daddy home to us, then he will come back. You don't know the answer to that question, unless you ask, do you? I was very thankful to have a mother who helped me financially at this difficult time. She bought me a massage bed, a magnifying lamp, product stands and therapeutic tables and trolleys, and I started offering beauty treatments from home in order to raise the extra cash that I needed to cover my household expenses, as without the extra income from my husband's salary, I'd be forced to move from my home. I was a qualified beauty therapist, so word quickly spread around my neighbourhood that I was open up for business. I began to be fully booked, so I felt heartily relieved that I could cover my household expenses without my husband's input, which was a godsend, enabling me to gain a certain amount of confidence that even without my husband I could still manage to survive, which was a liberating feeling indeed. Pete's side of the story. I knew leaving home was never going to be easy, especially not thinking about my beloved wife Laura and our precious kids, for thinking about them would be like remembering the chains that bound me to my old life. The pain associated with the death of my son would then come flooding back, which I needed like a bullet to the head. So I had to successfully empty my mind of thoughts associated with them by engaging in a convenient amnesia, which meant my memory was very selective. I was able to hitch a ride from my home in Denver with a very amenable truck driver that was driving past Yellowstone National Park, which is an exquisitely beautiful long drive from Denver among America's most scenic, stunning routes. As driving along Route 1, you drive past the Shoshone National Forest, between Grand Teton National Forest, the Bridger Teton National Forest, and around Jackson Lake. I was very fortunate that the trucker who gave me a lift loved all things beguilingly beautiful. He was driving a personalised, privately owned truck for a living, willfully picking, hand-selecting and choosing the very best jobs which offered the most stunning routes to take for his long-haul journeys. I was able to thoroughly enjoy the exquisite, beautiful views from the front seat of his truck, while listening to wistful, evocative country music from the likes of Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, which was both uplifting and exceedingly relaxing. The truck driver's name was Hank. He was an overweight, portly man in his 40s with an extensive tummy, which he explained was a result of his sedentary lifestyle. He had a bright smile of very white teeth, a full head of brown hair. He spoke with a very pleasant, reassuring, soft southern drawl. He was originally from North Carolina, looked to me rather like a wizened eagle, as he had a wisdom about him that was exceedingly engaging. "Are you running away from something?" "How do you know that?" I asked him. "It's the look," he said. "The lost, incorrigible, forlorn, hopeless look in your eyes. I've seen it a few times before. I've even worn that look in my own eyes from time to time." "Oh dear, is it that obvious?" I asked him. Not to most people, son, no. But I can see it in you very clearly myself. What are you running away from? Or don't you want to talk about it? I quite understand if you don't. But I do assure you I'm very discreet. A very good listener if you need a judicious, non-judgmental ear to listen. I suppose I'm running away from my life, the missus, the kids, all the god-awful pain, I told him. Hank let out a huge sigh, as if he understood. Oh, I've been there, son, myself. It's called hitting rock bottom. I've been tempted to run away from my life. All the responsibilities, the dreadful financial obligations. It can be all-consuming, let me tell you. I once almost blew my brains out, but I didn't have the guts to blow the trigger. I'm very glad I didn't. I didn't have the courage to do it when push finally came to shove, he said, stroking his moustache reflectively. I was a complete wuss, I'm not ashamed to admit. So you've been there too, I asked. That dark place. Hasn't everyone? I'm sure most people, if they've lived long enough, have gone through despair in one form or another. In truth, some of us just cope with it better than others do. That's why some of us pull through. Others aren't quite so lucky. So why did you hit rock bottom? I asked him. Well, you know, perpetual squabbling with the missus. Nothing I ever did was good enough for her. She was a very difficult woman, so demanding, always complaining tirelessly. I was constantly being henpecked. Do this, do that, do the next thing. You know, that sort of thing. It wore me to the ground like water hammering away at a rock over and over again. Well, what did you do? I got divorced. It was a hell of a lot easier than blowing my head off with the trigger. It was the best decision I ever made, getting rid of that old battle axe. I still don't know why on earth I married her. He chuckled. I guess I'm a sucker for a pretty face. But she's not so pretty now, let me tell you. What do they say? Beauty is fleeting. Never a truer word was ever spoken. These days that woman's got the face of a robber's dog. She's one hell of a scary-looking gal. I'm well rid of her, I really am. And now, I asked, are you happy with your life now? Indeed, I'm a very happy man. I found myself a very nice missus, who's got a heart of gold, she has. We have 2 beautiful children together, whom I would walk the ends of the earth for. They're my world. And why do you drive a truck? Isn't it a lonely business? Hank chuckled. He pointed towards the black cat lying between the 2 of us, curled up in a round ball, fast asleep. Well, I've got old Mr. Chester over there. That cat and I have a very good bond together. Mr. Chester thoroughly enjoys our long, exciting drives. I also get to speak to the missus on my cell phone every day, so I never feel too far away from them. I may ask you about your dark place, may I not? Or don't you want to talk about it? Well, my wife had a baby. It died during delivery. He was so perfect in every way, but totally dead. I've never been able to get over it. It haunts my life. I can imagine. That's very tough, bro. I am desperately sorry for you. I don't know what to say to that. I take it you've never told your wife about how you're feeling. We men tend to be very, very private about our emotions. It's not entirely good for us, I don't believe. Well, how could I tell her? I was the one that needed to hold the family up, to support her. She's in a good place now. But you're not, I take it. No, I'm not. It sounds like you've got a lot of soul-searching to do. I do hope you find the answers you're looking for, and that you find that place of peace that you're seeking. But I do hope you will finally return home to your family. Your kids definitely need their father. Hank dropped me off in a town called Gardner, Montanez, which is 4 minutes from Yellowstone's west entrance. To my amazement, he gave me his 4-man pop-up tent, a backpack, a sleeping bag, a change of clothes, along with $150. "But why are you doing this?" I said, unable to believe the truck driver's kindness. "I can't accept this from you, Hank." "Oh, of course you can. You're a kindred spirit, bro. It's my pleasure to be able to help you, and I don't need all that camping gear. Good luck with you, bro. I will definitely remember you in my prayers." I climbed out of the truck, brought a few groceries from the local town, put them in my backpack, and then answered an ad I saw on a piece of paper on a shop window saying cleaner wanted for Mountain Lodge, cash in hand salary. To my absolute amazement, I was given the job on the spot, starting the very next day. I was able to find a hostel to bed down for the night. Pretty soon I settled into my life as a cleaner. In a strange way, I found cleaning the Mountain Lodge very satisfying, mildly therapeutic. I didn't have to think about my other life. My boss was thrilled with my standard of work, vowing that men made far superior cleaners to women. When I was free, I would walk for miles at a time, drinking in the spectacular scenery of my location, refusing to allow my mind to think about my wife and kids. I'd been working in the town for over 2 months, staying in a grubby hostel that was full of youths travelling from Australia, New Zealand, Britain and parts of America, all looking for cheap, affordable accommodation. Some of them were incredibly nice youngsters whom I developed solid friendships with, and all these years later, I remain in touch with many of them. I decided to camp out in a pop-up tent the trucker had so graciously given me. I thoroughly enjoyed being close and personal to the natural world, and this was my quintessential opportunity. I found an old camping ground that was no longer in use. It had closed down, but the farmhand I encountered told me I was more than welcome to camp out on the property, so I took him up on his not-to-be-missed offer. "Why is the campground closed?" I asked him. "It's so spectacularly beautiful." The man looked at me with an awkward expression on his face that I couldn't quite comprehend. "The campers were complaining about strange activity on the campground," he told me. "They swore they were being bothered by Bigfoot throwing pine cones at their tents. Over and over again the owner got complaints about the activity, so she quickly closed down the campground. It wasn't any skin off her nose. She's a very wealthy woman, you see." "Bigfoot," I said, looking at the man with a curious expression on my face. "I mean, are those creatures even real?" "Well, if they are," said the kind man, "you're welcome to find out for yourself if you stay here," he teased. "Well, I don't believe in Bigfoot," I told the man. "There is no way those creatures exist." "If you say so," he said, looking at me with a knowing twinkle in his brown eyes that seemed to be almost taunting me, as if he knew a whole lot more than he was telling me. The campground was spectacular. I had this entire place all to myself, soon forgetting all about my earlier discussions of a Bigfoot. I found the perfect place to camp, overlooking an exquisitely beautiful lake that was almost electric blue, it was so beguiling. It quite literally took my breath away. It looked almost too perfect to be real. It twinkled like a blue opal in the afternoon sun. The lake lay between 2 mountainous valleys, surrounded by a vibrant mix of woodland trees, such as Engelmann spruces, lodgepole pines, white spruces, Douglas firs, mountain junipers, cottonwoods, quaking aspen, and some deciduous species that I couldn't quite identify. It was certainly a diverse, broad-ranging mix of trees, gathering together in congenial clusters and groups, rather like wizened old friends. Their contrasting shades of green added depth, tone, texture and beauty to the landscape. Their varying shapes and sizes were equally as impressive. Some trees were tall and thin like slender giants. Others were burly, wide, long-legged like substantial, towering, very overweight men, with solid, powerful bone structures, who carried their weight exceedingly well. The trees were as uniquely individual and different as an eclectic crowd of people gathered together in a vast football stadium. I managed to find a beach-like clearing, covered with very fine white pebbles, to put up my pop-up tent. I quickly got to work to prepare a fire, by gathering firewood and cutting it up, using a fold-up saw I'd borrowed from one of the Australian backpackers, which worked wonderfully in preparing logs for the fire. The young man had kindly left me some of his camping gear for the night, having heartily encouraged me to spend some time in the natural world. "Mate, you need to give it a go," he had encouraged me. "There's nothing like it. We camp out all the time in good old Oz. I've been doing it in the States. Best feeling in the world, mate, he said, giving me a big pat on the back. I gathered some wood together, preparing an open fire, where I put a kettle of water on to boil. I made myself a hot cup of sweet tea. It was one of the most delicious, tasty cups of tea I've ever enjoyed. My Australian friend was absolutely right. There's nothing quite like enjoying a cup of tea in nature. As the day began to cool quite significantly, I watched in awe as the sun began to set over the valley, in golden and tangerine glazes, dappled with pink, purple and mauve hues. I watched in amazement as the fire crackled and spitted in its rhythmic flow, while I began to fry a big piece of my marinated steak that I'd bought at the butcher's. The delicious smell of wood smoke and sizzling barbecue enveloped the air. I could see a small gathering of elk at the far end of the lake, gathering in a congenial group for a drink. Finally it grew very dark. It happened so quickly, like the blink of an eyelash. That was how fast it was, almost as if someone had switched off a light at the mains, and we'd had a massive power failure. I ate my delicious marinated steak, that was juicy and succulent, melting in the mouth like butter, tucking into the steak in a delicious buttered roll. I sat eating my sumptuous treat by the crackling fire, watching the yellow and orange flames spittle and crackle, along with listening to the pleasing dual chorus of the crickets and frogs. I was thoroughly enjoying the comfort of a camping chair, under the canopy of a spectacular firmament, where the light of a blazing full moon lit up the velvety black sky with a splendid bright luminescence, made all the more alluring and beguiling by the clusters of silvery stars that sparkled so brightly like the glittering, scintillating rhinestone jewels on a glamorous black evening gown. When exhaustion finally set in, I retired to my sleeping bag inside my 4-man pop-up tent, which was quite sizable and very pleasant. I left on an all-night light lantern that is rechargeable. I had bought it at the camping shop. I don't like to awaken to total darkness. The light enables me to see around the tent clearly. Soon I melted rather like butter as I sank back into the pleasing comfort of the soft-textured fabric of my sleeping bag, slipping into the gloriously liberating world of my dreams, where I was completely free to fly away to far-off places like an eagle on the wind. All of a sudden I woke up to hear a strange chattering noise. At first I thought it was part of my dream. It sounded distinctly like two people engaging in an intense conversation together, backwards and forwards, in an exuberant tone that was so excitable it almost certainly got my attention piqued. I wiped my eyes, realizing, no, this wasn't a dream. I was very much wide awake. I sat up in my sleeping bag to see two distinct figures in my tent, going through some of my kit, as if it was the most fascinating stuff they'd ever seen in their entire lives. I noticed the two creatures were definitely Bigfoot. They were small, at about 3 foot tall, thin and lanky, not much different to two kids of about 8 years old. But the major difference was they were completely covered in long flowing hair, the colour of coal. I was so fascinated that I sat back intrigued, watching these two little creatures intercede. They were so excited about a torch they were looking at, very amazed by how when you pressed the button it would turn on and off. The two creatures found this so thrilling. They kept snatching the torch from each other, each taking turns to switch it on and off, their dark eyes shining with wondrous awe, as they talked together backwards and forwards for ages, seemingly oblivious to my presence, as they eagerly discussed my torch with an impassioned, fervent interest. Suddenly a loud whistle could be heard in the valley. The two little younglings looked at each other, knowing full well that their mother was calling for them, and trying their level best to be as quiet and subdued as possible. But it seemed their mother was on to her two little younglings, knowing exactly where they were. I saw her boldly entering my tent, in a crawling position on her hands and knees. She was utterly enormous. I became painfully aware of my own vulnerability. She was wide, burly, easily bigger than a grizzly bear. If that creature wanted to lash out at me in any way, I was as good as dead. The two little critters excitedly showed their mother the wonders of my torch. Then the mother was talking in an animated, feverish, zealous conversation to her kids, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. I was struck with what a beautiful, loving family they were. For the very first time in 2 months, I began to think of my own family, of my beloved wife and 2 treasured children, and a longing began to tug at my heartstrings, a yearning to be back with my family again. The female Bigfoot was suddenly aware of my presence. She looked straight at me through her dark brown eyes. For a moment my heart almost missed a beat. I was terrified. I held my breath, afraid of what the creature would do to me. But she was benevolent and benign. She gave me an almost apologetic look, as if to say, "I'm so sorry to disturb you. You know what kids are like, real brats." The little youngling wanted to take my torch, but the mother slapped its hand as if to say, "It's not yours, put it back." I immediately intervened and said, "No, keep it." All 3 pairs of eyes focused on me. I repeated myself and said, "Please keep it." The creatures appeared to understand what I meant. The 2 little younglings started to whoop with delight. They were thrilled with my gift, while the female Bigfoot gave me a grateful look and nodded at me, as if to say, "Thank you, you're most kind." She then crawled out of my tent, followed behind by her 2 younglings, who just bent their heads ever so slightly as they left the opening. I quickly climbed out of bed, watching the creatures in wondrous awe as they glided away, swinging their arms and legs as they moved. They looked as if they were floating. I'm almost certain the female Bigfoot, when she was standing up straight, was easily 8 foot tall. In the distance I could see a bigger creature. I assumed it was the father figure. It must have been a family of 4. They were talking away garrulously about my torch, which had now been handed over to the father, who was examining it. And then they all slipped away into the woods. Once they were gone, all I could think about was my family. It was the first time in ages I'd actually thought about them, for 2 entire months. But now I knew that this was the perfect time to return home. I remember when I arrived home 2 months after I'd gone missing. I couldn't get to the front door fast enough. My wife opened the door to me. We just fell into each other's arms, so joyful to be reunited again. In truth, I never had the heart to tell my wife that the grief of losing our son had left me in a dark, tortuous place that made me want to abandon my life, her and the kids. Instead, I told her I had a bump to the head, had suffered from amnesia. I really didn't want to hurt my family more than I had to, but I think 2 months disconnecting myself from my life really enabled me to heal, as strange as that may sound. "So you didn't buy a ticket to heaven?" my son asked me. "No, I didn't," I said. "I wanted to come home to be with you." So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Mark, and my Bigfoot encounter happened almost 10 years ago in 2010. The story begins when my mother was talking to her stepsister on the phone. I was 18 at the time, and her stepsister called Tina told her that the family was going abroad for a 4-week vacation to England, Ireland and Scotland. They were so very excited, but didn't want to board their very large dogs and their single cat while they were away. But the last time they'd hired a sitter to look after their animals, he had let them down atrociously, and they had returned home early from the vacation. I gather he'd been using drugs and was high as a kite most of the time, and had done a very poor job in taking care of their animals. "I really checked all his background stuff," said Tina, "and no one had a bad thing to say about the young man. And look how that turned out. I don't know if I can put my trust in another sitter. I really don't know what I'm going to do." My mother suddenly had a splendid idea. "Mark's available for 4 weeks," she said. "He'll take care of your animals. Besides, I'm sure a little fresh country air would do him the world of good." "Mark," cried my Aunt Tina in delight. "Oh, that would be absolutely fabulous. But do you think he'd be up to it? It's pretty remote out here. The nearest town is only an hour's drive away. For a young man, that could be tediously dull." "Not for Mark," said my mother. "He loves the great outdoors and enjoys his own company." So it was all arranged. I was to go and stay at my step-aunt's house, and believe it or not, I was actually rather excited. I loved life in New York, but it really lacked the space and the openness of the countryside, so I was really looking forward to a change of scene.
I'd never been to my step-aunt's house before, so I had no idea what to expect. I had been instructed that all the keys for the house were under a large blue flower pot in the entrance to the property. I found myself driving down this remote dirt back road that looked like it had once been a logger's road. Both sides of the road were lined with large oak trees that swept back into the surrounding valley for miles, forming seemingly vast areas of natural forest. I finally found the shabby-looking pole gate that led up to another dirt road to a very large wooden cabin. The cabin was a Scandinavian-style full log home with a 10-foot-high log wall. It was really quite spacious and very pretty, which surprised me, because I'd never imagined Aunt Tina to have much style, but this log home was utterly enchanting. I could hear excited barking as I opened the front door and was greeted by 2 giant Irish wolfhounds and 3 very affectionate cats. I thought she only had 1, but it appeared to be 3, and they were very friendly to me. Inside the cabin was even more luxurious than the outside. The place was tidy, spacious, and clearly designed for comfort, but in a very stylish way, which meant there was very comfortable sofas strewn around the house that were so pleasing to the body as any bed would be. I could see Aunt Tina had prepared the fireplaces for me and kept the fridge and freezers stuffed and stocked with food and ready-prepared meals that she had labelled for me fastidiously. This really was going to be more like a holiday retreat than a chore, I thought excitedly. I lit the fire as it was starting to get quite chilly outside. I fed the dogs and cats and sat down to watch some television. Before I knew it, I'd fallen fast asleep. I was soon to learn that these sofas were almost more comfortable than a bed. I woke up to 2 Irish wolfhounds growling at the front door in such a way that I began to wonder that if someone was out there. I turned off the TV and listened, but I heard nothing. Then I realised there definitely was someone outside because I could suddenly hear a crunching of heavy footsteps on the gravel. I suddenly felt quite anxious and grabbed the firearm that was hanging on the rack close to the door. Who would be out here at this time of the night? Aunt Tina had not told me of any potential visitors, so I was not expecting anyone. Suddenly I heard a very loud slapping sound on the side of the cabin, almost as if someone was deliberately hitting the wooden beams of the cabin with a very large, heavy pole. The dogs went ballistic, and their barks were deafening, and the cats all scrambled under the furniture, hiding away in terror. If this was how the animals were behaving, the disturbances on this night were unusual for them. Should I be worried, I wondered? Should I call the police or a neighbour, or should I just wait and see if everything calmed down? And I'm glad to say that it actually did. The next few days that followed were incredibly beautiful, and the nights that followed were peaceful and serene, and I was beginning to forget about the intruder on my first night. But then the same disturbances began all over again, but this time the noises were thunderously loud, as whatever it was relentlessly banging the house like a heavy drum, as if it was trying to get my attention. I stumbled out the front door, clutching the rifle very tightly with both the 2 wolfhounds running behind me. They were looking up at the cabin and barking hysterically. I could smell this foul skunk-like odour in the air, and as I looked up at the cabin roof, I saw the silhouette of the most monstrous bipedal creature looking directly down at me. Bear in mind I'm a New Yorker, and I'm obliviously unaware of cryptid-like creatures like Bigfoot. Of course I have heard about those things before, but the notion of such a creature actually existing was preposterous in my mind's eye. I actually believed people who believed in such things were naive and gullible. As I gazed up at the rooftop, I knew I was facing a very dangerous, colossal creature, and whatever it was, I had no idea. I just stared up at it in stupefied silence, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. This thing was colossal, much bigger and more frightening than a grizzly, and its body was covered with dark, short hair. What I noticed about this creature was the weird cone-shaped head that flowed down seamlessly to a huge pair of shoulders, bypassing any need for a neck. The upper torso of this thing reminded me of the Incredible Hulk. It was so monstrously big that it made the hips and legs look thin by comparison, yet in reality every appendage of this gargantuan beast was monstrously big. I'm not good at estimating weights and heights as a general rule. However, I think I can safely say this thing weighed 1,000 pounds and was at least 10 foot tall. The creature stared at me with a very large primate-looking face, with a very prominent brow ridge, flat nose and a thin mouth, but it was those eyes, so deep-set and brown, but had a very definite red eye shine that put the fear of God into every cell of my body. The eyes were as round as saucers, and truly they glowed in a red traffic-light colour. It felt like they penetrated me like a red laser light. I watched the creature pounding the cabin with the large timber pole he was carrying in his long arms. It was like he wanted me to see what he was actually doing. What on earth was he trying to do, I wondered? Why was he beating the cabin like this? If he was trying to scare me, it was working because I was terrified. I was a city boy and stuff like this I knew nothing about. It was all beyond me. I aimed the rifle at the creature, not knowing what else to do, and when he saw me do this, he let out the most awful, frightful scream, and it sounded almost feminine, almost like a female being murdered. It was so terrifying that even the dogs yelped in terror and scuttled back into the cabin, looking for somewhere to hide. I watched the creature jumping off the side of the house, about a 14-foot drop, I kid you not, and the creature landed on his feet that appeared to be very padded, with the agility of a domestic cat. And then he literally tottered away on his padded feet across the ground with the speed and grace of a cheetah, and then he was gone from my sight. I stood there for a long moment in total silence and absolute awe, trying to mentally comprehend and make sense of everything that had just transpired, and then I went back indoors and bolted every single door and window, and I allowed the dogs to pee on newspaper because I was not coming out of that cabin until the morning. The next day I examined the area outside where the creature had scuttled away, and there was an area beyond the gravel where the ground was actually wet, and I discovered 3 very distinct footprints that measured at least 17 inches in the ground. Now, believe me, that's big. Suddenly I noticed a young woman coming up the drive. In truth, I was relieved to see someone human after everything that had occurred the previous night. She had brown hair tied back in a ponytail and was wearing jeans, boots, and a white blouse. "Hello," she said, reaching for my hand. "My name is Sue. I'm your closest neighbour. Tina told me you were looking after the animals while she's away. I know this is going to sound strange, but I wondered if you've been experiencing any strange activity, such as banging sounds at night on your cabin." "How do you know about that?" I asked. "Because something weird's been going on over the last 3 days. 3 of the neighbours have been experiencing these angry drumming sounds on their houses. I just wondered if you got to see anything. Everyone was too afraid to go outside their houses to see what was going on, but something was on their roofs, banging away very violently." "I saw it," I said to Sue, and I proceeded to tell her about what had happened and how I had seen this massive creature on my roof hitting the cabin like a drum. "You do know what you saw," said Sue. "I believe you saw a Bigfoot." "But are those things actually real?" I asked. "You tell me," she said. "You're the one that actually saw it." "What does he want?" I asked. "Good question," said Sue. "Why, after all these years, without ever seeing sight or sound of these things, is this creature very suddenly trying to scare us all half to death, and not just you, all 3 of the neighbours?" "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. "No, never, but I have heard their whoops and owl calls, so I know they're out there. People go looking for these things, you know, but they tend to be so elusive and private. There are occasional sightings, but some people believe they're bogus or misidentified." "And you?" I asked. "Do you believe these sightings are bogus?" "If I did then, I don't now. I know there's a huge creature on our roof last night, banging away, and you got to see a Bigfoot, so it's clearly what's going on. A Bigfoot has been terrorising not only you, but 3 of the other neighbours too." "Where do you think they actually live?" I asked. "Look around you," laughed Sue. "There are forests absolutely everywhere, abundant wildlife, loads of water sources. What is there not to like for a Bigfoot here? They could live anywhere around here, especially in those forests." "Has there been any changes around here recently?" I asked suddenly. "I have heard that animals don't like sudden change." "Oh my word," gasped Sue. "You could be onto something there. All this commotion started after my dad started logging in that forest over there," she said, pointing in a southerly direction. "It could be their habitat. I suggest maybe it's a spot where they live and they're expressing their anger." "Excuse me," said Sue. "I've just had an idea. I'm going to phone the logging team and find out if they've been experiencing any abuse from this creature." She dialed a number on her mobile phone,
and I watched her pacing up and down the drive very nervously. "But where did they go?" I heard her say. "When did this happen?" "What did you say? Thanks, Rolf. Speak to you later." Sue looked at me, and her face went as white as a sheet. "The loggers have all bailed," she said. "They're simply refusing to work, because they've been terrified. Something's been watching them and has been throwing big boulders at them while they've been logging. They've been hearing growling and roaring sounds in the forest and seen the shadow of a giant-like creature staring at them through the trees, and he's hostile, aggressive, and relentless in his actions. And apparently the forest stinks because of this thing." "It must be the Bigfoot I saw," I said. "He was colossal." "Well, we're all in danger if something's not done about this. I'll speak to my dad." The next day I learnt from Sue that they were no longer going to log that particular area, and her father had called a halt to the activity and the logging because he didn't want this creature to harm anyone, and he didn't want to go after the thing either with all guns blazing. "We need to leave those things well alone," he'd said. The moment the logging stopped, so did the banging on all our homes, and everything went back to normal, and I was able to enjoy the rest of my stay at my aunt's cabin. I did go with Sue to see the woods where the loggers experienced the Bigfoot activity, and they were beautiful and teeming with wildlife, and there was a sparkling spring running through the whole area. While we were there, the forest went incredibly quiet, and we did sense eyes on us, so we both left the place as fast as we could, and have never been back. I returned to New York and continued my life, but something in me has changed dramatically. I used to be so set in my opinions about things, and reluctant to consider other possibilities, but now I'm much more open to things. I also believe it's made me a much nicer person, more sensitive to the feelings of others, and I like myself more these days. What some people might pooh-pooh as impossible, I will stop and consider, because who knows, it could and it just might be true. I like the fact that I don't have to close the door on an idea because of a limited mindset and a closed belief system. I know that if Bigfoot is out there, then there may be other cryptid creatures like him too. It's got me wondering about legends of old when strange creatures were described and accounted for in the past. Could they be real too? Anything is possible to me now, and for me the world has become a much more exciting and mysterious place.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.